Hey everyone, this is your host, Andrew Holland. Thank you so much for listening to the Andrew Holland podcast each and every week, where we talk about business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. As an entrepreneur who's been through a lot of highs and a lot of lows, I started this podcast to be a source of weekly motivation, inspiration, and support for all of us who are working to achieve something meaningful. And as importantly, so that none of us ever have to feel alone or isolated while we're doing so. Together, we explore the stories of successful people, we get insight and advice from individuals who have accomplished amazing things. We discuss practical and fascinating business models and strategies, and we dive deep into understanding ourselves as human beings. So please, help me grow our group and subscribe to the show on your favorite audio platform. Subscribe to, watch, and thumbs up our episodes on our YouTube channel, the Andrew Holland Podcast. Follow and interact with me on Twitter and Threads. My handle is A Holland Podcast. That's A Holland Podcast. That's probably my favorite part of the whole podcast is the interaction I get with our guests and with you as our listeners. Lastly, if you enjoy the show and you want to support what we're working to accomplish, please share our show with your friends, with your family, and your colleagues at work. This show is nothing without you and your support, and I'm so incredibly thankful for each and every one of you listening, watching, and sharing the podcast every single week. Now it's time to get our motivation, inspiration, and support for this week and jump into today's episode. In today's episode, I sit down with Garth Stevens. He's a partner with Snell and Wilmer, and he's a practicing merger and acquisitions attorney. So he helps companies buy other companies, and he helps primarily private companies sell their companies. We talk about what it's like to sell your company, what it's like to buy a company. We talk about his advice to people that are just starting a company in terms of structures and things to think about. Because oftentimes, when it comes to sell your company, if you haven't thought about from the very beginning, setting up the appropriate legal structure, making sure that you have all your ducks in a row in terms of who's owners, who's not owners, and having it properly documented, it can make things a lot more challenging during the sale process. We also get his take based on the almost 30 years of experience he has working with on M&A transactions, what business models he's seen that have been particularly successful, what industries he would potentially go in, or how he would think about if he was going to start a business. And we also talk about what it's like to be in business with family, should you have business partners, and we cover a whole range of topics that Garth gives us a really interesting perspective on, having been involved as a primary attorney on multiple buy and sell transactions with companies. I learned a lot from Garth. He shares an incredible amount of advice and a unique perspective as an attorney, and I think you'll find the same thing to be true. Enjoy our conversation.
Andrew Holland is a CPA, a real estate broker, and involved in multiple businesses, including some investment companies. The Andrew Holland podcast is for informational purposes only. All of Andrew's views and those of his guests are solely their opinions and do not reflect the opinions of any of the businesses or companies Andrew or his guests are affiliated with. You should not treat any advice, conversation, business recommendation, investment recommendation, or anything of the like as a specific inducement to make a specific business decision, take a specific action, make a particular investment, or follow a specific business or investment strategy. Thank you so much for listening and enjoy the show.
Garth, thank you so much for joining us and welcome to the Andrew Holland Podcast.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
So you're an attorney, specifically an M&A mergers and acquisitions attorney. So give us a brief description of what you do, how long you've been doing it, and then as importantly, one of the things that I love to hear and our listeners love to hear is give us your life story. Where'd you grow up? What was your childhood like? How did you end up becoming an attorney, helping companies sell, private companies primarily, sell or buy companies? Give us some background.
All right. That's a lot. I'm not sure where you want me to start, but I'll start with your first question is, what is a mergers and acquisitions or an M&A attorney? And a lot of times if someone says, what do you do? And I'll say, I'm an M&A attorney, and there's a blank look on their face. And I'll say M&A, or mergers and acquisitions, is fancy lawyer talk for buying and selling companies. So primarily what I do is I work with companies of all sizes, whether they be smaller family-owned businesses up to very large billion-dollar entities, either acquire companies or sell or divest divisions or subsidiaries, or they themselves entirely get sold. Uh, that makes up, probably at any given time, depending on how busy the market is, anywhere from 60 to 80% of what I'm doing. And then I'm just also the outside sort of general corporate counsel for a number of clients. I used to do a certain amount of securities offering work as well. That's raising capital for companies, either publicly or privately. Over time, that work has gone away for a variety of reasons, not the least of which is I just liked the M&A work a lot more.
Yeah.
Found it a lot more interesting. There was more creativity involved. In terms of background, I've been here in Arizona now since May 2000, so coming up on 24 years. But I actually started my career in Canada. I was born in Toronto, although was raised and moved as an infant to Vancouver on the West Coast, which for those who don't really know, is a little bit north of Seattle. Grew up there, went away to college in Ontario, so central Canada, a little bit north of Syracuse, which is where my school was, in Kingston, Ontario, and then went back to Vancouver, worked for 3 years, junior management position at a head office of a life insurance company.
Yeah.
It was a good learning experience, but definitely not something I was ever going to do as a career.
What did you go to college for?
I did a political science degree. I was a liberal arts guy. I kind of sucked at math.
Okay.
I liked some of the general science. I liked biology, chemistry. Once you got into physics or hard math, I was like, I'm out. This is just, my brain just doesn't work that way.
Theoretical physics and some of those things.
No. Once I hit trigonometry, the Peter principle kicked in. Yeah. I was always creative. I was always good at writing and communicating. I always had a bit of a, I don't want to say assertive personality, but I liked kind of debating stuff. So I just kind of leaned. So I went to college thinking I was either going to go to law school or maybe get into journalism. Like I said, came back to Vancouver, worked for 3 years, and then it was like, okay, it's time to go. So I went to law school on the far East Coast in Halifax, Nova Scotia, which is northeast of Maine, and most Americans aren't going to realize you can go northeast of Maine and still be on land.
I was going to say.
there's this sort of large, sort of elbow-shaped peninsula, which is Nova Scotia, which historically the only thing probably would be mostly known for were it was one of the main convoy points in both the First and Second World War. So shipping went out of New York Harbor or Boston to a lesser extent, and Halifax to England or Ireland, and then in return.
Okay.
So did that, had a great time, loved Halifax, loved the people there, but it's kind of like Maine. There's not a whole lot going on there if you want to be a business lawyer. So I came back to Vancouver, practiced for 5 years at a national law firm, the Vancouver office there. Funnily enough, I went to law school thinking I was going to be a litigator, so a courtroom lawyer. My father was a corporate securities lawyer at a large law firm in Vancouver, and I grew up watching what he did and the hours he worked, and I said, I am never going to do that. It looks really boring, and the hours are really long, and he seems stressed out a lot.
Yeah. So how did that take you to a litigator?
Well, because I think a lot of people, including kids today, I'm old enough now I can say kids today, referring to 20-year-olds. You see a lot of movies, you see TV shows, and they're always clever and they got the right lines and they solve the problem at the last minute with some clever move in court, which is all complete nonsense. It just doesn't really ever work that way.
Good for TV, not real life.
Yeah. So, but anyway, I went to law school. Along the way, discovered I really liked business law. I liked business. All aspects of it, and I was losing interest in litigation. And then what happened is unlike in the US, when you sort of graduate law school, you have to do a 1 year of a program. It's referred to as articling or being an articled student. It's like being an intern in the medical field.
Okay.
And you work at a law firm. You're doing everything a first-year associate does in the U.S., but you don't get paid very much, and you can't sign stuff as a lawyer. You're supervised. But part of that program is you do about I think it was like a 10-week mandatory bar course, which you don't have to do a mandatory bar course in the U.S. Most people want to do it to train up to take the exam.
Yeah.
But that course had a lot of practical aspects. So you had to draft a contract with these facts, or we would go into a courtroom at night when it wasn't in use, and we would practice doing a cross-examination or something.
That's
like
fantastic.
that. Well, it was, except, I'm sort of naturally competitive, and I tend to give everything my most. And I did my cross-examination to another student, and I made her cry. She burst into tears, and I was so pumped up after. I was ready to punch holes in walls. I was like, and then when I came down from that, I said, I don't want to do this. I feel terrible. I mean, I apologized to her after. I wasn't screaming at her or anything, but I just had her so wrapped up and trying to catch her and stuff because I was so into the moment.
Sounds like you were born to be a litigator.
But the thing is that as much as I said, I like to debate, I like to get into topics and stuff, I'm not a naturally adversarial person. I don't like getting into pissing matches with people. And besides the fact that I don't like getting in people's faces, I don't like how it makes me feel. So that, combined with the fact that I was really liking business law more, I was realizing, you know what, that isn't for me. And, I think of the litigators in our firm who are just some of the nicest people. And I've asked them before. I mean, they say they can just flip a switch, and it's not like they turn into junkyard dogs. They, there's a more thoughtful way to be a litigator.
Yeah.
But anyway, that wasn't for me.
It really does take a certain type of person. My older sister's a criminal defense attorney, and she kind of moved more to being a guardian ad litem representing kids, where she could feel really good about, a husband and a wife fighting and wanting to kill each other in a divorce. But her only interest is the child, and that's all she looks out for. But in my experiences, I'll tell you what, I want a litigator. Being in business, you get sued, and sometimes you have to sue.
Yep.
And, in one of the businesses that I had, we got wrongfully sued. And I was so thankful. Nicest guy ever. But when you put him in a courtroom, he was exactly who you wanted on your side.
Sure,
so it's interesting you described this flipping a switch, because that's been my experience.
Well, and the whole process, the whole system is designed to drag stuff out and make it expensive. And it's just, that was the other thing is, and I think my first recollection or inclination that I wasn't going to want to do this is, I mentioned the 3 years I worked at the head office of an insurance company. So between my first and second years of law school, I came back and I actually went back to the insurance company to kind of manage their little litigation files and working with lawyers. And so many times I was looking at these situations, which were such simple matters, and just the letter writing and the positioning. And I thought, this is ridiculous. And I'm a very goal-oriented, project-oriented person, get from point A to point B, which again is what I like about M&A, because you are helping someone get from point A to point B. And didn't like the nature of the whole process. And I've told a lot of times, junior associates or summer associates come into our office and they're not quite sure yet what they want to do. And, and I'll say, look, I'm not trying to tell you what you go with, what your heart tells you. You go with what interests you.
Yeah.
But, in litigation, you have a winner and a loser. And the old joke is, if there's a settlement, both sides feel like losers.
And that's true. Been there.
Yeah. In transactional law, for the most part, everybody is pulling to get to the same place. And that doesn't mean you don't negotiate hard at times. But at the end of the day, even when you've had a hard-fought negotiation, and sometimes the lawyers butt heads a bit, everybody's saying, thank you, great job, enjoyed working with you. And I've picked up a lot of referrals over the years from lawyers who were on the other side of the table, who, for whatever reason, they or their firm couldn't handle the matter. But they said, hey, you know what? You were good. You knew what you were doing. You were respectful. You represented your clients well, and I would trust you to represent my client or this other client. So
that's fantastic.
It's a much more positive, productive career track than I think, in my view anyway, speaking as
Well, and the litigation system drives me nuts, as you've alluded to. Our whole court system, we could spend 3 hours talking about. You would have far more experience and knowledge on how we could fix it. But so what brought you down to Phoenix? You're a partner at Snell and Wilmer, focusing now on mergers and acquisitions, again, helping people buy and sell companies. How did you get from Vancouver down to Phoenix?
So for starters, I never thought I'd leave Canada. My wife, who I met in law school, she was a year behind me. She was from Montreal. Her dad was a electrical engineer who would take these postings where they would live in the US or in Europe or wherever. And so she was more of a traveler. And she used to say, I just have this feeling one day we're going to be moving probably to the US. And I said, nope, never going to happen. I lived in Vancouver, which is one of the most beautiful cities in the world, and grew up there, had family, friends there. But more and more as I became an income earner, and more specifically a taxpayer, I just saw how much of my income and her income was going out in taxes, and it was becoming increasingly frustrating. I was working like any junior lawyer, incredibly long hours. We lived in a starter home. We had 2 cars that were paid for, that which weren't fancy.
Mm-hmm. How old are you at this time? Plus or minus?
I'm in my mid late 20s.
Okay.
I started law school a little later because I worked for those 3 years.
Yep.
So, late 20s. If we went on vacations, it was typically to her family's cottage in Vermont, which was just south of where her parents lived in Montreal, or my parents had a golf property in Tucson.
Okay.
So we weren't living the high life. We
Yeah.
were doing all the right stuff. We were, maxing out the Canadian version of a 401k, and we were, paying our bills and all this stuff. But at the end of the month, you're going, where did the money go? We're living paycheck to paycheck. We're both professionals at large law firms, and you're going, where did the money go?
Yeah.
So, I was really starting to question. I was starting to do out the math. And one night I kind of just pulled out a pad of paper and a pencil, and I started adding up, estimating what I figured taxes were. And I at the end of the day, income taxes, property taxes, sales taxes, which at the time between both provincial, which Canada has provinces like states, and federal was 14%. So on goods and services.
They have a national sales tax that's 14%.
Well,
or was it local?
Since I left, the federal tax was called the goods and services tax. Now they have this harmonized sales tax, which they've kind of blended the two. And a few provinces like Alberta don't have a provincial sales tax, but where I lived, I was paying 14% sales tax on goods and services.
14%.
On top of stuff that's already expensive. So, one night I'm doing this and I'm going, I think roughly 75% of every dime I earn is going out the door in one form of a tax.
Why does anybody live there?
Well, it's a great country in a lot of ways, but you pay the price. And a lot of people Canadians in general, I don't think are as mobile as Americans. I think that has to do with geography. There's only so many big cities in the country. I think Canadians a lot of them, I don't mean this in a disparaging sense, are not always as upwardly mobile and motivated as Americans. And I think that has to do a lot with the social safety net that exists.
Yeah. Well, how can you move up when 75% of your income is going to the government? You can't even hardly get ahead.
Well, and then Vancouver, I mean, even back then, the real estate prices were crazy. They've been nothing but insane since then. So, coupled with living in an expensive city and just this, so I was more and more going, this has got to change. And then there was one silly day I went into the passport office it was time to renew my passport. And they had built this brand new spanking facility, huge, modern, 20 kiosks. And I go in first thing in the morning to get in there early on the way to work. And they had like 2 kiosks being serviced. And I was told my wait time was 2.5 hours. And I was steaming all day. And I went home that night and I pulled out, back then, this is before, iPhones and maps, our Rand McNally road map. I said, that's it. We're out of here. Like, this is where my tax dollars are going.
Those 18 empty kiosks.
So, it happened really fast. And we started looking at this and we said, okay, where are we going? And that was too hard. It was like, okay, where are we not going? And so I'd gone to college in Ontario and law school in Halifax. I'd done Central and East Coast. And as much as I love the winter for skiing, I can otherwise do without it. And I really don't do humidity that well. So kind of East Coast, no. College was on a Great Lake on Lake Ontario. Never was going to live on a Great Lake again. It's freaking cold in the winter. So that kind of cut out Chicago. California has had and still has all the issues that Canada has. So I was like, forget that. Even though I did have a couple of headhunters from firms reaching out to me in California. So it was kind of the Western states, and it was sort of Seattle, Portland, Denver, Phoenix, Texas, and just sort of by an exercise of, kind of removing the ones for one reason or another, kind of came to Phoenix. I knew nothing about Phoenix, but I'd been to Tucson a number of times because of my parents' golf property. At the time, both of my siblings were working in LA. So I thought, okay, relatively close to see my siblings. My parents will be down a chunk of the year. I'll see them. Reached out. This was in early 2000, so during the tech boom still.
Okay.
I was about a fifth-year associate, give or take, which are very hard to hire. Large law firms, trained fifth-year corporate associates are valuable because you're trained, but you're not so trained you can't kind of mold them to your own firm's ways. And your skills, they can do a lot of the work. So they had never hired a Canadian, though, so it was kind of weird for them. So I originally just came down. I was literally on one of these trips where we're just going to hang out at my parents' place for a week, and said, well, I'm going to make a few calls. Online research at the time, Snell and Wilmer was the biggest and best firm in the city, and I think today still is. reached out, asked if it would be possible to come in for an informational interview, just to kind of get your foot in the door and learn a little and have them maybe get the idea in their head. That was a Wednesday. It was I don't know, a 30 or 45-minute interview with two partners in our corporate group it ended well. It was fine. And I thought that was going to be kind of it. And then they asked if I would just stick around for 15 minutes. They went out, came back in, said, would you mind coming back on Friday for a few more interviews? And I thought, oh, okay, this is interesting. And came back on Friday and went through a gauntlet of, I don't know, 6 or 8 hours of interviews. And about 3 weeks later, had a job offer. So that was, I want to say February. And then by May, we had sold our house in Vancouver, moved my family, which included a 10-month-old baby, down. We figured out the visa stuff to get down here. Was signed up to take the bar exam in July, which did that. And
because you didn't have reciprocity from Canada?
No,
okay.
you don't. So you had to take the bar exam here, which was, I did sort of a bar course, a prep course in advance. And it was kind of funny because it was a bit like sort of a redo of law school, a redo of 3 years of law school in, I don't know, 3 weeks, coupled with certain things I had to learn that they didn't teach in Canada, like the U.S. Constitution, different litigation procedures. A lot of the rules are sort of the same.
Yeah.
Community property laws, things like that.
So. There's so much. I want to get into the meat and potatoes of what you do because we have so much to cover there. But there's so much advice that you just gave in your life story, whether you realize it or not. One of the things for me is, and to anybody listening, especially if you're young, figure out where you want to live. And maybe you don't know. And I think that's an interesting approach for you. I like the approach you took. Where don't we want to live? And that narrowed it down. Then you were able to narrow it down from there. One of the things that I regret, in spite of, I'm very thankful that I stayed in Wisconsin for as long as I did, grew the company, was able to sell it. But when you move, I eventually moved to Arizona, as I shared with you at the beginning. You moved pretty early in your career. But when you move kind of midway, not to say that you should let fear hold you back, starting over can be tough. So the sooner you can figure out where you want to live and start establishing those relationships and gaining the expertise in whatever field someone's working in, the better off you're going to be. And you did that. And what I also like is you didn't let fear hold you back. I see so many people who are miserable every single day. And I'm thinking, and I love the Midwest. So thankful for being born in the Midwest. Midwest nice is real thing, work ethic. But there's a lot of people who are so afraid to move or try something different, even though they're not very happy. And I think there's a lesson to be learned. You said, I'm paying 75% plus or minus 75%. Let's get out of here and try something different. You knew nothing about Phoenix. So thank you for sharing that. And I think there's a lot of information that if you're kind of stuck in that position and you're like, oh, I can't move it, you can move.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an impulsive person. In fact, again, I always joke that I think a lot of people that become corporate transactional lawyers, we like business, but we're too cowardly to be entrepreneurs ourselves.
Well, I was going to say you're a lawyer, and I know very few impulsive lawyers, which is good.
Well, it is. I mean, so we tend to be very, thoughtful. We consider stuff before making decisions, and that's, this move we made was by far the craziest thing I think I ever did in my life, other than maybe some sporting or other activity related things. But I think I'm my typical approach to stuff is, look at the situation, analyze it, figure out the best course of action, and then make a decision. And then based on that decision, act, but then act all in. I mean, I don't know if you've heard of the OODA loop, but it's OODA loop.
What, the OODA loop?
OODA loop, OODA. It was this concept developed by this really brilliant guy by the name of John Boyd, who was an Air Force pilot, who became this sort of guru, philosopher and all. But OODA is observe, orient, decide, act. And you're constantly doing this. So the idea was, if you're an Air Force pilot, if you're in the air and you're in a dogfight, you're observing what the enemy's doing, you're orienting yourself to the enemy, you decide what you're going to do, and then you act.
Makes sense.
And then before the enemy can go through his own OODA loop, you're doing it again before. And so the idea is to get inside the loop. And so this has been translated into, if you Google it, you'll find all sorts of stuff. It's been translated into business, professional sports, all this stuff. So I mean, I think my approach is, as I said, I mean, you take the time to make a considered decision, make that decision, but once you do it, then execute.
Yeah. I want to talk about, so you move down to Phoenix and you start developing an expertise. in helping people buy and sell their companies. And like you said, you help raise private capital. And I want to talk about that because,
Yep.
in the business world, there's lots of different financing options,
Yep.
whether you're buying or selling your company, and of course, raising capital no matter what you're doing. You primarily work with private companies, correct?
I do. I mean, there was a time when we had more public clients, or I had more public clients. Excuse me. We would do acquisitions either of other public companies, which is a much more complicated process, or a public company acquiring a private company.
Okay.
So I typically would tell people I either do private or public.
Okay.
But yeah.
Makes sense. And just for our listeners, a private company is owned by individuals, so you or I can't buy it in a public company. Is sold in the stock market, so you can have public.
I mean, a private
ownership.
company can be owned by other companies. It's just that the equity, the stock of that company is not publicly traded on the stock market.
Yeah, an average individual can't just buy into it.
Right. Yeah.
So before we get into those specifics, you've worked with a lot of entrepreneurs. What deal sizes do you primarily transact? You're doing some really large deal size. What's the largest deal size you've ever done?
The largest I ever did, which I wasn't the partner on, but I was a senior associate on. This was back when I was still practicing in Vancouver. It was around a $500 or $600 million deal. It was a three-way merger involving Ford and Daimler, Benz, and our clients. So it was a Canadian, U.S., German deal. It had a lot of moving parts. It was really interesting.
And then you also do some, I'll say smaller, but they're very meaningful to the owners. Anywhere between $6 to $10 million. So you go, towards the smaller deal size, in the range of deal sizes to maybe mid-market, middle market.
Yeah, I mean, a typical, we are a middle market firm in a middle market geographic market, Phoenix, Midwest, or Southwest, I should say. Nowadays, I would say the middle market is in the range of, the lower end is like 25, 30 million. High end is your 150, 200 million. But on average, for us, I'd say typical deal is in the 50 to 75 million range. But I do a lot of deals in the, 10 to 20 range, in some sub 10. The only thing I'd say about the deal size is, we're a large firm. We're not cheap. I'm not cheap. I don't mean that as a bragging point, but I just mean it from the economic standpoint. Somebody that wants to sell their company for $8 million and they have to use 1.5 of that to pay off debt and whatever, and pay their taxes at the end of the day, we may not just economically be the right person in terms of what the legal fees are going to be to sell the company. But with that said, I've told clients, some very small clients, whether it's an M&A deal or otherwise, and they've said, "Am I too small for you?" And I've said, "Look, I'm every bit as interested in your deal as anybody else's, and your dollars are every bit as green as everybody else's." So I don't turn away work just because it's not worthy of me because it's too small or something like that.
I love that approach. But I also like, obviously economics have to make sense to the business owner. And my point in asking this question is you've dealt with entrepreneurs of all shapes, sizes, on the revenue spectrum, small businesses, medium businesses, large businesses. When you think about all the entrepreneurs you have interacted with, what do you think sets them apart from the general population? Or more aptly put, what characteristics stand out to you as to what makes a successful entrepreneur versus an unsuccessful entrepreneur?
It's a great question. I will say, number one, because of what I do, I'm mostly just working with successful entrepreneurs. Meaning that there's a lot of people that start up companies that for one reason or another, whether their fault or not, they never go. So in my little universe that I work in, most of the entrepreneurs I come across are successful.
Because they're coming to you when they're ready to sell their business. Makes sense.
But I have dealt with other entrepreneurs either, through my work or other acquaintances, and you see the full spectrum. The one thing I would just say is they've got the guts. And years ago, I made this comment, going back to kind of one of the comments about Canada again, is I think there are so many more entrepreneurs and so many more successful entrepreneurs in the US than in Canada because you don't have the social safety net here. And some of my longest, clients / friends who are just serial entrepreneurs that just do so well, they came from nothing, like poor, no college, no opportunities, started off with, in the garbage business, one truck. And at the end of the shift, when they were driving around, they were under the truck, fixing the truck. And
been there.
Yeah. And they just grew it incrementally, bit by bit, but they had the guts. And part of it, I think, was they were like, well, what have I got to lose? versus, where I come from, which great countries, social safety net, good public education, decent healthcare, not nearly as good as, a lot of people down here who advocate for that think it is. It's not nearly that good, but it's not as bad as the other side says it is either. But my point is that when you don't have all that stuff down here and you want to make something of yourself, you go for it. So I think there's that drive. You don't have to be a genius, but it certainly helps to be at least bright and smart and able to learn and adapt. So, I mean, those are, I think, the things that I really notice about the people that are successful, and they're just generally good people. The people that I've seen that are not successful entrepreneurs, they're not very smart, and I don't mean necessarily intelligently. They just make kind of bad decision after bad decision. They're not that open to being educated or informed, whether by professional advisors or otherwise. They're really caught up in their own, I don't want to say BS. I'm trying to remember the term that Steve Jobs used. Something distortion field. Do you remember the term he used?
I know what you're talking about, but I don't remember.
Yeah, reality distortion field. They're so caught up in their idea that they don't see all the potential roadblocks or real roadblocks. And sometimes they're just not very nice people.
Yeah.
They just use and abuse people. They take advantage of people, and they're going to probably fail in anything they do, whether it's entrepreneurial or otherwise. They've got all these things. But I think if you're generally a good person and you're a hard worker and you treat people well and you're willing to learn and you're willing to adapt, most people can do this.
I think one of the things that you just highlighted that's so important, and as an entrepreneur, I struggled with, especially a young entrepreneur who's really dumb, ignorant, naive, think you knew a lot. I was 22 or 23 when I started. We all kind of in different spectrums, but I particularly had that problem. You get that beat out of you by the entrepreneurial system and the economic system and real quickly, which was a really healthy thing for me. But ego is the destruction of success. And so it's interesting when I hear you talk about the people that aren't successful, their ego, which encompasses thinking you're better than other people, so you treat them poorly, not listening to other people and the value of other people. And so they've got this reality distortion of a really stupid idea, and everybody tells them, but they're convinced it's going to be great.
Yeah.
And then I like what you boiled. They're just not decent human beings. They just don't treat people decently. On the flip side, all the successful people you work with have the exact opposite qualifications. And those are, forget about entrepreneur. Those just seem like normal, good life principles. Absolutely. So it doesn't seem like it's that difficult. But in this day and age, it's seemingly few and far between. You and I both know Giz.
Yeah.
One of the, you talk about the salt of the earth type of people.
Yeah.
And he deserves every bit of success just because he's just salt of the earth people like you're talking about. Are there any, we've kind of talked about the grit aspect, and you've been involved with a lot of deals, successful deals. You see entrepreneurs, and having been there myself, and you've written a great article, which I'm going to put in the show notes. It's called On Your Marks, Get Set, and Get Some More, Preparing a Private Company for Sale. This is one of the best M&A articles I've read, Garth, and I'm not saying that just because you're in studio. You do a really good job of taking lawyer speak and getting rid of it and boiling it down so that any average individual can understand it. So I encourage everybody to read it. But my point in bringing that up, you hit some really key topics. If you're thinking about selling your company, or even if it's 5, 10, 15 years away, what you can do to prepare, because the more you prepare, the more successful outcome you're going to have. And you talk about it in that article, and I want to get into some of the intricacies there. But you see people in some of their most emotional, raw states because they are oftentimes selling their baby, something that they have sweat. They've sacrificed family. Not saying they've lost their family. I'm just saying being an entrepreneur takes a lot of work, and you make a lot of sacrifices. You lose a lot of friends because they can always do stuff and you're focusing on your company. It's really challenging. And now they've become successful, whether it's 5, 10, 15, 20, 25 years later. And now they're thinking about selling their child or giving it up for adoption just in is raw. That's how meaningful it is to a lot of entrepreneurs,
Yeah.
because that's how much they've given. Obviously, kids are a lot more important than companies, but tell us about the emotional aspect of selling your company that people need to prepare themselves for. And in so doing, give us an example of where one particularly stands out to you, where it's stuck in your mind about how big of a deal or how big of a psychological impact selling your company can have.
Sure. Well, I'll talk about two different angles. The first one, which maybe is easier to talk about, is I call it the frustration angle. And that is, if you're an entrepreneur, I mean, that's a very broad term, because that means everything from you're just starting up your company to, hey, you've run this company for 30 years and it's worth 50 million bucks.
Yeah.
You're not really an entrepreneur anymore. You're a business owner, right?
Yeah.
But we'll use that term. But you're the business owner.
I appreciate that's a good distinction, a very good distinction.
Yeah. You're probably still very busy running your business. Now, you may not be out there under the truck anymore, but you're in the office every day. Like Buzz Gibbs would talk about, loved coming into work every day. And you're on the phone and you're calling shots and you're walking the plant floor and you're talking to people and you're doing everything that is your job. So now you're going to sell your business. And the next thing you know is you're getting bombarded for months, not days or weeks, months in this process with information requests. And I need you to review this document. And can you provide that? And hey, we need to set up a meeting to talk with this person. And you're juggling all this. So there's the layer of stress that goes with already being really busy with your business, and then all that stuff that comes with the deal. And then I don't want to say it happens all the time. I'd say, again, I can only go from my perspective when I hear from clients about this, but I'd say, I don't know, 10, 20% of the time in these deals, at some point, the clients are just like, I can't do this anymore. I'm so fed up. I can't believe all the stuff the buyer's asking for. They're being so unreasonable and blah. And by the way, the buyer's probably not being unreasonable.
Yeah.
It's just, they've got their job to do. They have to do their diligence. They have to make sure they understand what they're buying. But at some point, the seller starts getting frustrated, or there's some hang up on the negotiations. There was an agreement in principle up front that the price was going to be X. And now the buyer is saying, well, we did this quality of earnings review, or we're a little concerned about the fact that this major customer contract is just terminable on notice. And we think we want to lower the price, by Y. And now the owner's going, this is BS. They're gaming me and blah, blah. And usually when that comes up, there's already a certain level of simmering that's been going on. And so, the owner's like, that's it. I'm done. I'm not doing this deal. And I've had more than a few conversations at times with sellers where I've kind of had to walk them back. And the main one I use is eye on the prize, right? Or see the forest for the trees. This is an annoyance. This is one part of this much bigger universe of what we're working on here. And by the way, when this boiling point happens, to use a football analogy, you're usually like on like the 15-yard line. So
but you're really getting down to brass tacks.
And so you're really close. And now, have I at times told an owner who's met with some change in the deal terms? Yeah, because sometimes buyers will, or their lawyers will try and put stuff in that's it's not what we call, it's not market.
Yeah.
Right. It's just not what's done. But most of the time when it happens, it's just more emotional. And so you kind of act as that kind of therapist, counselor, rabbi, priest, what have you, to help kind of bring them back, saying, look, we're close. Let's work through this. You can do this. So that's the one angle on the note. The other one is the actual, to the more the point you were talking about, is this sort of angst that can turn into a real almost a desire to walk back the deal and saying, wait a minute, I'm not sure I want to sell now. Now, you've talked with Buzz about this, and I chatted with him, and he said, yeah, you can talk about this.
Share that story, because it's Buzz and I didn't get a chance to share it when we were, but it's a real eye opener.
Yeah. So I didn't sell. I was the lawyer selling both of Buzz's companies, Paddock Pools originally back in 2005, I think it was. And then Paramount Industries, which was 17 or 18.
Yeah, I think 18 is when it closed. Yeah.
And Paramount Paddock was the business he took over from his father. But Paramount, even though it was sort of started under his father, Buzz was really the guy that grew that thing into what it was.
Yeah.
And that really was his baby.
Yeah.
And as he, said in your podcast, and as he's told me many times, he loved that company and he loved that job. And, he's still a relatively young guy. He's older than me. I just turned 56, but so Buzz is in, his 60s but he's still a very vibrant.
Well, he takes amazing care of himself.
Yeah.
You would never guess he's in his 60s.
Yeah.
He just he comes into a room and just the life that he has is
totally
really impressive.
So I mean, he's not some person that's ready to roll off into retirement. But at the same time, there were things lining up. I can't remember all the parameters, but I think there wasn't really going to be a handoff to any of his kids. The offer was a very fair offer. There were some sibling ownership, so I think he wanted to do right by his siblings as well. So a variety of things, but which all kind of led to the sale. And that was a pretty typical sale process all the way through, probably including a few times where I had to, calm Buzz down when he was getting pissed off by some of the stuff. But yeah, I remember it was around a week, maybe not more than 2 weeks, maybe a week, 10 days before the scheduled closing. And we're talking on the phone. And I can't remember if the call was for this purpose or it just came up in the call that Buzz said, I'm really having some second thoughts. I don't know if I want to do this. I'm just, my gut's twisted and I just feel like, what are you doing? This is I don't know if he said this is your baby, but that was the gist of it. And it wasn't my job to say, oh no, Buzz, you really have to sell. It was just listen and be there and talk it through and say, I get it. And I've heard it before and it's not an abnormal thought. So, we just talked it out and he didn't make any decision at that point. But we continued. It wasn't like he said, stop work, pencils down. So we go through to the closing, and a typical deal closing way back when everything was done with paper, you had all the paper around a big boardroom table and the lawyers were all checking to make sure everything was in order. And the business people came in and signed documents and then shook hands. And maybe there was a bottle of champagne to open or something like that. Nowadays, these deals are pretty much all done where the paper is sent back and forth by email, PDF documents, people sign, lawyers email stuff back and forth, make sure everything's in order. And that's actually usually done the day before the actual closing. So the closing itself the next day is this rather
anticlimactic
event where everybody gets on a conference call or a Zoom call and says, all right, everybody here. Okay. Everybody ready to close? And it's typically like a 5 or 10 minute call and that's it. And so we have this call and it was I think it was in the case with Buzz, it was a phone call and everybody's going around and yep, good to go. Law firm on the buyer side. Yep. Good to go. Snell and Wilmer. Yep. We're good to go. And buyer, yep, and then Buzz, and there was just this dead air. and Buzz, and nowadays with Zoom, you can tell when someone's phone is muted. You can say, "Hey, Buzz, you're muted." But this was just a phone call, and it was. I think Buzz might have said something like, the more dead air, and then, yeah, we're good to go, and yeah. He was that close.
In talking with him, obviously that time probably felt like an hour to him. I think he said it was a good 3 minutes. And I asked him what was going through his mind, and he said, I don't even know. It was such a jumble of thoughts. And the reason that's such a powerful story, and for someone who hasn't maybe sold a company yet, if you are blessed to grow a company and you decide you want to sell it, and there's a lot of different exits for a company other than selling it. Passing it down to the family, that's technically a sale, but to a third party, let's say that. It's hard to wrap your head around just how emotional this can be and how big of a deal this is. And it doesn't matter the deal size. So that's why it's interesting to share that story. And for anybody thinking about going through this process, or maybe you're going through this process right now and that's how you're feeling. I think to your point, it's so helpful to have people, your tax attorney or attorneys who don't just know their trade, but they understand the human element of it. And it's clear to me that you do, and you've done enough transactions where that's, as you said, you've got to be a therapist, rabbi, counselor during a lot of the process. But if you haven't done it before, it's impossible to prepare for it. But to the extent that you can mentally, given all the transactions you've gone through, the good, the bad, and the ugly, and I want to talk about some of the more ugly deals. because there's always stuff to be learned in mistakes or bad deals or things gone wrong. That's where we learn all of our how we become successful through our failures, right?
Yeah.
What, from your perspective, can someone do to the extent that you can to prepare emotionally for that transaction? And I will add, it's not only emotional for the business owner themselves, their family,
Mm-hmm.
their employees, their executive team, their management team. And I want to talk about the anonymity. For me, that was the hardest part. We were so close to our employees, and I just felt like I was living a lie every single day, but I wasn't at will to disclose that we were going down this path because there's confidentiality
Yep.
agreements. So, well, so much that we can get into, but how can someone mentally prepare for going through this process?
Well, for one, I would say get thinking about it as early as possible. In other words, we're in January now, and don't say, I think I'm going to sell in May. Now it's time for me to start thinking about it, right? If you have some sense of an exit strategy, be that a year, 2 years, 5 years, 10 years, the sooner you start thinking about that, the better. And not just from the sort of logistical and administrative side, but the more you have that in your head,
Mhm.
the longer that's in your head, the less weird or stressful it's going to be when the wheels actually start turning to make that happen. So I think the first thing is just prepare yourself. Be thinking about it long enough into the future. And as I said earlier, when I was going back to when I was kind of talking about the whole, the OODA loop and executing and everything. I mean, I think make a really informed decision. Take the time to talk to other people that have sold their companies. What goes into it? Talk to your investment advisor, accountant, lawyer. Again, I'm not talking about the nuts and bolts of how do I get the deal done. It's I'm thinking of this. What are the things I need to be thinking about relative to my own personal situation, relative to my family situation? Um, and the more of that you can do in advance, the less stressful and maybe to some extent the less emotional it's going to be when you're finally really putting into that plan of action. And then I think once you've done all that and you're ready to commit, then commit. But understand that you're not forced to close. And I have worked on deals where a seller has backed out relatively close to the end, which typically doesn't make the buyer happy. And sometimes I've been on the buy side when that happens. But you have that option. So you can also go into that process of, I'm going to do this, but I'm not walking the plank with a saber to my back either. I can always decide if it's not right for some reason not to do it.
Talk to us about the most interesting transaction you've had where that has happened and why it happened. Obviously, there's technical reasons that can happen. You described to us earlier the buyer's attorneys try to slip something that's just outside of market. And I don't know if you can say they're acting in bad faith, but to me, it seems like they'd be acting in bad faith if they're trying to put something that's not in market. But sometimes buyers and sellers just don't see eye to eye.
Yeah.
So give us a few interesting examples of failed transactions that you've gone through. And obviously, for confidentiality reasons, don't disclose
Yeah.
the parties, but give us some of the reasons that they fail, whether emotional, technical, what have you.
Sure. I don't know if I'd call any of them that interesting, but I'll give you some examples. So I would say the number one reason that transactions fail, and this is after a letter of intent's been signed. So, a letter of intent is like a non-binding agreement that lays out the basic terms.
Mhm.
We're going to buy your company for X amount of money, assuming certain things turn out to be accurate, like financial performance and condition of the assets and so on.
So that's kind of the start of the process. I'm a
Yeah.
business owner. I want to sell my
Yeah.
company. I come to you and say, okay, and we'll get into finding buyers, but let's
Yeah.
assume we found a buyer. I've got
Yeah.
a competitor that's interested in buying. We sign a letter of intent.
Yeah.
And that kind of starts the process and just lays out the basic
Yeah.
structure, but nothing's really set in stone and it's
Right.
non-binding.
Right. Yeah. There's a few terms that are binding, like each side agrees to pay their own transaction costs, and the buyer will keep confidential any information that's given to them. But for the most part, the deal terms, yes,
Okay.
are all non. So typically, when a deal falls apart, for lack of a better term, after a letter of intent, it's one main thing, probably the main thing, is as the buyer gets into the actual due diligence process, that's kicking over the rocks, looking at the financial records, doing a quality of earnings analysis, this type of stuff. they discover that the business is not as healthy as they were led to believe. And that doesn't necessarily mean that the business owner was being deceitful. Entrepreneurs by nature are optimists. They sometimes have rose-colored glasses.
Yep.
And they tend to view things through this idea of this is great, this is going to be really good. And for instance, I've got Walmart as a customer. This is fantastic. The buyer notices that, yes, you have Walmart as a customer, and that customer makes up 80% of your revenues, which is not a good thing, right? At least not for a buyer.
No, you want diversification of revenue stream.
Right.
Unless if you have a 50-year contract
Yeah.
or something, obviously.
Yeah.
But
so, I had one deal where it was that example where I had a large company, serial acquirer, and they were going to buy this other company, and went in, and the company wasn't too poorly run. They had some things that needed, but they were something like 90% dependent on Walmart. And so, our clients said, there were some other things, but they said, that's just.
Do you want to talk about scary as a business owner? If I were dependent on one, especially someone who has leverage. When Walmart makes a decision, they can destroy your company overnight.
A big part of it is simply the buyer discovering, hey, this is not what we thought we were buying. That doesn't always mean the buyer is going to walk away. What they may come back and say is, look, we offered to pay you, give you an example, $20 million for your company. When we crunch the numbers, when we look at your quality of earnings, when we take these things into account, you're really only worth $15 million. And then it's for the seller to say, well, forget that. I'm not selling for $15 million, which might be a perfectly legitimate answer. Mm-hmm. Or it might be, well, okay, we'll move ahead at the new price, or there'll be some negotiation in between. Or it could be something's discovered in due diligence. I had another deal recently where we just discovered that the regulated business, and there was just a lot of carelessness to the point of negligence in how the company was being run. Besides the fact that it created all sorts of liabilities for the business, it also indicated that, well, the business is this profitable because they're not spending the money and time and effort to be a legally compliant company. Yeah. And if they were expending that money, it would be less profitable. So that was another one where client walked away on the buy side. When the seller walks away, it's either in response to the buyer saying, yes, we need to change the terms because of what we found. Or it could be just something personal in the seller's life. Suddenly a spouse has been diagnosed with a medical condition, or there's something else going on where they just can't manage running the business, selling the business, and these personal things. So I've had that happen a few times, and obviously that's a very human thing that can happen.
So they walked away from the deal because the obligations of time to go through with the deal just weren't on the table because of personal factors.
Yeah. Or maybe it changed the dynamic. It was going to be, my plan was to sell the company and retire and go on a 3-year cruise with my wife. And now my wife's got 3 months to live, and that whole plan's out the door now. Mm-hmm. Pretty tragic.
Yeah, it is.
And then the other one could be just, a seller for some reason is just, as they get into the process, going, what am I doing? I'm not saying never, but it's not now. I will say those are rare in my experience. Mm-hmm. But I've seen that happen.
What's the ugliest transaction you've been a part of?
I don't know if there's any one ugly transaction. I would say that the thing that, for me, that makes transactions ugly, and this is more when I'm on the buyer side, is sellers that are represented by really bad lawyers. And not just bad lawyers, but bad lawyers that use bluster and rudeness
to negotiate.
Well, not just either to cover up for their incompetence or just because that's who they are. And it kind of goes back to, we talked about what makes a successful entrepreneur versus someone who's not. And like any profession, right? There are great lawyers, good lawyers, bad lawyers, terrible lawyers. Say that about plumbers, doctors, dentists.
You name it. Yeah.
Right. Some people think that someone has a law degree, that they're special, they're smart, they went to law school. Ooh, well, you know what? We're a dime a dozen, right? And we're all walks of life and all types of personalities. So, I've said before, and I think I said it, in the article, I always tell sellers, make sure if you're selling your company, you have a good lawyer, not just a good lawyer you like, but a good lawyer who is an experienced deal lawyer, knows how to do this. Because it's such a harder process when a lawyer on either side of the deal, but it typically occurs on the seller side, doesn't know what they're doing. Yeah. They focus in on stuff in the deal that it's stuff that's just so kind of wrote and established for a deal, and then they miss stuff they should be looking out for the seller that
Mhm.
they should be focusing on, and they're letting it go by. But when you couple that with someone who's just belligerent and rude, and you're trying to get a deal done, and my approach always is, and I think most good lawyers, this is the approach is, hey, we're all trying to get to the same place. There's no need to be jerks to each other.
Mhm.
There's no need to take hardcore negotiating positions that you know you're going to negotiate to the middle. Let's both try and start out somewhere closer to the middle, and then it'll be a lot easier for everybody. But yeah, you get some of these people that, whether it's just their personality, whether they view it as a competition, it's an ego thing. Sometimes they're just incredibly protective of their clients, which I'll give them credit for that,
Mhm.
right? I mean, there's something to be said for that. We are supposed to be, the term is zealous advocates for our clients, but you can take that only so far,
Mhm.
right? Especially when you get it to the point where you're no longer doing it for the benefit of your client,
Yeah.
whether you
Yeah.
realize it or not.
But Garth, when you think about ugliest transactions, there has to be something that comes to mind.
Uh, yeah, I mean, I can't think of one that was just a complete, disaster. I mean, I will tell you, there are times when I've got a lot of deals on the go and I'm at my wit's end, just hours in the day, and everybody's pressuring and everybody thinks their deal's the only one you're working on. That again, that can make stuff ugly, but you should have asked me this one in advance. I might have come in and 28 plus years of doing
Yeah,
this
you got a
now. It's
lot
a
of deals.
lot of deals. I can't say, and I think that's a good thing.
I
By
was
the
going to
way,
say, I guess that's a
yeah,
good thing
it is
that
a
you
good thing.
can't.
Yeah, I can think of a lot of really great deals and with a lot of really great people, clients, lawyers, and otherwise over the years, which I
That was going to be my next
yeah,
question.
yeah,
So if you can't, it's good that you don't have an
yeah,
ugly deal, because if you had an ugly, you would know me. I mean, I've heard of. Thankfully, I haven't been a part of any particularly ugly deal, although some of the deals I've been a part of has not been enjoyable, but a lot of them probably aren't. But most rewarding. When you think about the deal, when let's say you were going to retire tomorrow and you're like, you
yeah,
know what? When I think about, and obviously there's a lot, you have a lot and you have a lot of great clients.
yeah,
Buzz is a perfect example.
yeah,
But when you think about, for whatever reason, maybe it was the personal situation of someone who came from a really bad background and you just saw them create something and change the life of the next generations of their family. What comes to mind?
It's funny that I had to think about that for a sec, but I think it was the very first deal I worked on when I moved to Arizona, and it was not a big one. And what was life changing for the people? It was a family owned business in Arizona uh, that, just for kind of confidentiality reasons, I'll keep it somewhat general in description.
Mhm.
But it was a service type business that was a specialty service, not something anybody would either could do or would want to do. But they got talked into sort of selling their company into one of these sort of roll up groups where a
Mhm.
bigger group had bought them or buying other similar businesses. And nowadays that's very common with private equity, and in my experience, for the most part, very legitimate. This particular case, the people that had acquired this family business were just kind of scoundrels. And um, once this kind of business was under their ownership, they had their fingers in the till. They were, you know, buying themselves expensive suits. It was really seedy. It was really just
Mhm.
low level. Like, it wasn't like they were stripping the business and buying a corporate jet. They were just using the
Yeah.
money for restaurants and
Yeah.
suits and stuff like that. And the family they still had a partial. I think this company had bought like 60% of them or
Okay.
something like that. So, and we were not involved with that original deal,
Mhm.
but I was brought in by another partner in the firm who I think had somehow been referred to these people. That person was actually a litigator, but the resolution was really they needed to negotiate an exit.
Because that had gotten so ugly, the
And
60-40
yeah,
ownership.
and the parents that ran this business, they were in their 60s. Their original plan had been to turn the business over to their son, who was a good young man who was already working in the business, but they were just trapped, and they were seeing their retirement whittled away. They were incredibly stressed out. Their health was suffering, and this other company, I'm just by virtue of the contract, they had no leverage. They had no bargaining power. They had nothing. The only real option they had was, which, if I recall, was what we kind of used as leverage, was just to say, well, we're just all going to walk away. We're going to leave this business in this, it wasn't a super small town, but it wasn't a big city.
Mhm.
There's going to be no one else qualified to run it. You guys want it? all yours. And these guys weren't operators. These guys were just
Clearly, they were
you know,
just
they're there to milk small business owners.
yeah.
So it was a pretty long, drawn out negotiation. I do remember at one point when we finally closed the deal, we signed the paper at our firm in our office downtown. I was so annoyed with the principles of the other side that I told the lawyer, "You can come in and we'll sign. You bring in your signed paper. I don't even want to see your clients." I think it was probably the only time where I was so
Wow.
mad at a transaction party other side that I don't want to say I didn't trust myself like I was going to throw a punch or
No, I
anything,
know exactly
but
what you
I was
mean.
just like, there is no reason for me to be in the same room as
Yeah.
your clients.
Yeah.
I don't even want to see them. And they were just real dirtbags. So the good news was we got the deal done. I remember, the matriarch of the family just giving me this big hug at the end. She was just in tears, just the relief that they got their life back, they got their business back. There was an economic setback there,
Yeah.
but they were back on, okay, it's ours again, and we can go back to passing this to our son. And yeah, that was a pretty nice way to start my legal practice in
Yeah.
Arizona.
So they bought the 60% party out
Yep.
and took full
Yep.
control of it.
Yep.
There's so many technical details that we can get into, and I want to get into those because I think that's really helpful for people who are anticipating or thinking about this. But the majority of people that are entrepreneurs or business owners aren't selling their business right now. I say the majority. There's lots of business owners out there that are just running their business every single day, and they hear this like, "Oh yeah, that's great, Andrew and Garth, but I'm so far away from running my business. I'm just trying to keep my employees or find employees or stay in the positive or get out of the red and get into the positive." For those people, and they're years away from a sale, or maybe they're never going to sell, and that's not even in their realm right now because running a business and the day-to-day grind is all consuming, and if you're far away from a transaction like that, you don't really care about selling your business. You're not thinking about that, I should say. But you've seen a lot of entrepreneurs, you've seen a lot of business models, and they're entering into your life when they're at kind of that pinnacle point, if you will. What advice would you give to people who are really far away from it or hearing this and saying, that's great, maybe in 50 years I might be to that point? What advice can you give to them just about business in general based on the experience that you've seen with so many entrepreneurs? And that can be personality wise, that can be emotional wise. And then I want to delve a little bit more into business models and industries and where you see the future and opportunity and things to think about financially in terms of multiples and valuations.
Sure.
But give us some more generic advice to someone who's so far away and
Yeah.
they're just running their business, but you have a lot to offer and advice because of the experience that you've seen.
Sure. I mean, obviously, it's a little presumptuous for me as a non-business person to give business advice to a business person. So I'll start off by saying that. Um, I would say that, and I do mention this to clients from time to time who are not at the point of selling or even thinking. In fact, sometimes I was just having this conversation the other day with a client who's a serial entrepreneur, was just starting up another company, and where he had acquired a very early stage company and he's going to try and do something with it. But um, anything you're thinking of doing that involves shortcuts, especially with respect to legal compliance, or how you raise capital, again, on the legal compliance side, at some point, if you ever think you're going to sell that company, you're going to have to represent to a buyer that you've been doing everything right, that the company is legally compliant, that shares were issued in compliance with securities laws, for instance. And if you can't give those reps later, or worse, if the buyer discovers during their due diligence process that you've got these problems in the business, for example, as I mentioned earlier, why some deals fall apart, it's going to bite you in the butt, potentially.
Mm-hmm.
And that old, an ounce of prevention's worth a pound of cure. It really can mean something. Now, look, a lot of entrepreneurs will do things, ask questions later. They're not necessarily doing something tending to be dishonest or unlawful, but they don't know, and maybe they don't necessarily want to know.
Yeah.
And some of them have become incredibly successful that way.
Mm-hmm.
But where you have the opportunity to do something right, where you received information or advice that, hey, that's maybe not the right way to be doing it, you want to give some thought to that.
Yeah.
that's probably the main thing I'd say.
That's great advice. And I think there's also, you go back to there are also industries where, okay, if you're in the medical device industry, heavily regulated, you take shortcuts, you'll never sell your business. Like, you're done. And I've been in an industry where you had to register with the FDA and have FDA compliance. Whereas we're in the garbage industry, there's a little bit more, I don't want to say flexibility, but it's not as tightly controlled. Um, but what I would also ask you is, where are examples, you brought up securities and you brought up raising capital. And I will also reiterate, having been as an entrepreneur, the first time I saw that reps and warranties. Now, I'm a CPA by trade, so thankfully I've been blessed with some sense of background and thought about going to law school. And then I looked into this is 2008, and I'm like, there's a million attorneys. I'm never going to be able to find a job. I was lucky just to find one as an accountant. And I've been in the financial industry, so I at least had some basis of being aware of some financial terms. But when I saw those reps and warranties clause, it's like, holy smokes, I wish I knew this before I started my business, because now I got to figure all this out or make sure we did all these things out. But to your point, an ounce of prevention is worth a pound of cure. And sometimes what you don't know is the most destructive piece when it goes to sell your business. So even if you're not even near there, be thinking about these things. Raising capital. You said you used to do that.
Yep.
Talk to us about, finances are, of course, a big issue for every company. It doesn't matter, public, private, raising capital, whether you're doing it from family, friends, whether you're going into the public markets. Have you ever taken a company IPO, or not really?
As an associate, when I started off, my first 3 or 4 years, it was during the heyday of the late 90s. It was the big tech. I mean, I was an associate. I wasn't the lead partner in those deals, but we were just running those like off the assembly line, IPO after IPO.
Yeah. And then 90% of them kind of went away, but that's the way of the world. What advice do you have on raising capital, whether from friends or family, or starting a new business, or maybe you're 10 years into it and now you kind of have to take the next level and you're looking for one investor or a group of investors? What advice can you provide to people who are thinking about doing that?
Well, first thing is, when you go from owning your own business to bringing in investors, the landscape changes. Once you have issued shares or LLC interests, what have you, to investors, you are now a fiduciary to them. You have to act where it was your own company 100%. Again, not great for tax and accounting, but you could kind of reach into the till when you needed something. Mm-hmm. You can't do that once you have other investors. You have a fiduciary obligation to operate the business in the best interests of the company and its owners.
And it doesn't matter if they're a minority owner at 5, 10,
That's
15.
Right.
It doesn't matter. That's that right. Fiduciary responsibility comes the second you bring someone else in.
Right. So you have to be mindful of that and the responsibilities that go with that. That doesn't mean the day-to-day operations of the business change, but it does mean certain decision-making changes, including risks that you might have been willing to take when it was just your company. You've got to be more mindful of now. You still have the right, as assuming you control the board of directors or you're the sole director, you still have the right to make those decisions, but you're supposed to make informed decisions acting in the best interest of the company. You potentially have people that are going to be bugging you as investors, wanting information, wanting financial statements, wanting to know what's going on, wanting to know if they can have a seat on the board of directors. And most of that stuff is established up front, typically, if you do a proper equity raise, but not always. A lot of early stage companies, they'll bring in friends and family, or triple F, friends, family, and fools. You sometimes hear the term. And
I haven't heard that. That's a really good one.
And they don't always think about this stuff. But the next thing they know, they realize that Joe down the road owns 10% of my company. I had a client years ago, started up a company, ended up selling it, did extremely well.
What was the industry?
If you're at liberty, it was to say? Internet security services. Okay. And my only regret is at one point he offered if I wanted to invest, and it was either invest or take some of my fees in equity. And I said no. There was ethical reasons why I couldn't do it for fees, but in hindsight, I'm kind of kicking myself.
I was going to ask you that question of all the deals you've seen. So,
but no, there was a person that was going to invest, but they said, I want, on top of my shares, I want it was something like a non-dilutable 5% warrant or an option to purchase additional shares, meaning that no matter how many shares of the company are ever outstanding, I can always buy enough shares to get me 5% for this price. And
It was a set fixed price.
yeah, which is typically what an option or
Okay.
warrant is, right? It says you can buy X number of shares for $5 a share. But what can happen over time, of course, is as the company issues more shares, that gets diluted as a percentage of the total. And this person wanted something that said, no matter how many shares the company has, I can always get 5% when I exercise it. So I told this client, I said, that's crazy. You can't do that. And he said, I need the money. And I said, you can't. And he said, well, I'm going to do it anyway. I hear you. I appreciate the advice. I said, okay, here's what I'm going to do. That's fine. I'm going to write you a letter that says, I advise you not to do this. I need you to read it, sign it, send it back to me. He said, why? I said, so you don't sue me later, because you're going to regret this. And he called me like the next day and he said, I talked to my wife, and we were friends, by the way. He became a client because he was a friend first. So I knew his wife. He said, I talked to my wife last night about what you said in the letter. And you know what? I think you're right. I think I'm not going to do this.
I mean, he was blessed to have you as an attorney, because, would he have ever been able to really raise capital from anybody else if there was this one? I mean,
it's a good question, but he also would have just been kicking himself for, so that one's a bit of a rare specific occurrence, but those things can happen. So, but yeah, you have to understand, anytime you're bringing in an investor, it's just no longer your company, even if you own the controlling ownership of the company. So there's all that goes with that. And then the other aspect is just how you issue that equity. And the main thing is the Securities Act of 1933, just referred to as the Securities Act, governs all issuances of securities: equity securities like shares or LLC interests, debt securities like notes or debentures. And it doesn't matter. It doesn't apply just to public companies. It applies to every single company that issues securities. And the main thing are the anti-fraud provisions. And I won't bother getting into kind of the technical stuff, but basically you can't lie to people when you're issuing security. You can't make a material misrepresentation.
It's kind of sad that we have to have a law that tells us that, but
you're right.
We do.
We do. And, but before
Garth, you can't lie to people?
Well, and
what?
It's called the Securities Act of 1933 because it came in after the stock market crash, right? Because before that, there was no law that says you couldn't lie to people. And so now you cannot make for many years now, you cannot make a material misrepresentation of facts, knowing that they are untrue, with the intention of trying to get people to invest. And that, that also goes to failing to state stuff that would be material information. So, a lot of times I'll come across companies, again, where we weren't representing them during some capital raise. And it wasn't they were out there intentionally doing it, but they were just careless how they did it. There's also rules how you can raise money going out to investors. And people think public offering means you go through this gigantic process through an investment banker, and then you get to go ring the bell at NYSE. And the way the Securities Act works is a public offering is defined as anything that is not a private offering.
Pretty broad, huh? Do
you know what they define as a private offering?
Remind me, because I had a hedge fund in the digital asset world, and all of that, I'm so glad not to be dealing with any of that again.
They don't define it.
Oh. So it's not even like, isn't there something like as long as you offer it to 5 or less people or something related to that?
Yeah. So, well, for starters, they don't define by statute what a private offering is. There's been a bunch of case law that has come out to said, if you do this or that. They did ultimately create something called Regulation D, which creates a safe harbor that says, if you follow these rules, then you'll be deemed to have done a private offering. But that came in much later.
That old Reg D. I heard that a million times from our attorney. I'm sick of Reg D.
Yeah. But where all of this is going is, you will get people that will issue securities not even being aware of all these rules, and they'll just call up people. They'll think about, I'm going to broadcast this on the radio. I'm going to set up a table at the entrance to my golf club. And a lot of that stuff can constitute a public offering of securities. So I'd say if I can kind of summarize all of that, I'd say, number one, be aware of the consequences of bringing in investors. And number two, make sure if you're going to do this, how to do it, and make sure you're doing it legally.
Yeah. Great advice. And it is, the first time I delved into that world, it was very overwhelming, and because there are all these little nuances, and we don't say this to scare people, because they do have opportunities for small sales, or where you're not publicly issuing it, but you are talking one-on-one, and I don't remember you know that all of that a lot better than I do. If you're publicly issuing it, what you can do with marketing, and if you're not, then you
Yeah.
fall into this classification. And anyways, talk to us about just have a good attorney if you're going to think about doing it, is ultimately what it comes down to, if that's not your bailiwick. Talk to us about, I ask a lot of entrepreneurs and all the guests that I have, and you're in a unique position because you see from the outside looking in on business relationships and family relationships. And I ask, should you have business partners, or go it alone? Should you go into business with friends and family?
Hmm. I, I, I will give you the true lawyer's response. It depends, right? I mean, number one, in terms of business partners, that just comes down to the circumstances of the particular person. I mean, to me, if you're going to have a business partner, there has to be some creative reason. You know, 1+1 has to equal 3, or maybe even 1+1 equals 2. But there has to be some reason. A person might be great with the trade side of the business, but just is terrible with the admin, accounting, legal, HR side. And so they've got a partner that loves that part of the business, and together they can make this successful business. A person, may want some equity, some more money to help grow the business, but they want that person to be passive. That person, as an investor, is technically in a way still a partner. They're just not operationally a partner. So there could be all sorts of circumstances where it makes sense to bring in a partner, and other times it doesn't. In terms of friends and family, especially family, I mean, that's a whole other dynamic. And I've worked with a lot of family owned businesses, and especially on the family side, maybe not so much friends, but
That's why I asked the question, because
yeah,
I imagine you
yeah.
got a lot of stories you could tell.
A lot of times what I experience is you'll have a family member, one or two, who are doing the lion's share of the work, if not all of it. Another family member who's doing none. For some reason, they've got some equity in the company. A lot of times it's because the parents who are the founders of the company pass down shares to all of the kids to be equal. Um, and you end up this kind of simmering resentment. The one who's not involved with the business, either by choice or otherwise, resents the fact that the golden child, son or daughter, who's running it, gets more of the attention from the parents, and they're getting a salary, so they're sucking, in this person's mind, they're sucking money out of the company that could be paid as a dividend. Meanwhile, you got the people that are running the company, the siblings, and they're annoyed with the sibling that doesn't work. Like, I'm busting my butt over here so I can pay that person, quarterly or an annual dividend. And so you definitely hear that stuff. You can have, even if all family members are involved with the business, whatever kind of internal family traumas or angst that have occurred bleed into the business. I mean, it can be any variety of things.
Have you seen that?
I've seen it all. I mean, yeah.
So this is where we get into some really fun, obviously confidential, but when you think about that, what is the messiest situation you've seen where, and this is the piece that people don't understand. They think, well, when we're in business together, it's going to be all business, and then outside the business is going to be family. Chutzpah. That's never how it is. So tell me where you saw family matters start to interact or interfere with the sale of the business or even the operations of the business.
Well, I mean, I'll tell you a good one. So one company was an S corporation, which, for people who know, that any corporation that you form starts off as what we call a C corporation. You can make an election with the IRS to have the corporation taxed as an S corporation, which gives you certain tax benefits, sort of pass-through treatment. But there are certain rules that apply to be an S corporation. The main one being it has to be owned only by U.S. persons who are individuals, in other words, natural persons, or certain qualified trusts, like a family trust. So an S corp, for instance, cannot be owned by another corporation or an LLC unless that entity is also a corporation or tracks as an S corp. Okay. So one particular deal, a sibling was not happy with the sale, felt that she was not getting her fair share, or that the price should have been higher, and so on. And we didn't need that sibling's vote to approve the deal. She had a small enough percentage that we could have got the deal done without her. I mean, she still would have shared in the proceeds, but she said, if you proceed with this deal, then I'm going to transfer my shares of the company into a new regular C corporation, which I'm doing, quote unquote, for estate planning reasons, which was a farce, what it would have done, it would have blown up the company's S corp status for everybody, and it would have resulted in very significant tax consequences for everybody. So it was a complete extortion.
How did that end up panning out? Did she use that as leverage to get what she wanted?
In the end, I think there were a few attributes of the deal that were changed that I think would have put a little more of the purchase price outside of some of the other ways the funds were going to be expended back into the purchase price. She didn't get everything she wanted.
Mm-hmm.
But it was unfortunate. This was a person that had never done anything for the business, was going to come away with a lot of money from the sale, but there was family stuff there, which I think was driving it more than anything. It brought the deal for a short period of time to a halt until we could resolve it. Other stuff I've just seen is, where, another family-owned business where the son, who was a really good guy, very smart guy, garbage business again. The parents were older. The father was in early stages of dementia. He had something, I think it's called sundowner syndrome, where he was pretty sharp, pretty with it in the morning, but as the day kind of progressed, he would become incredibly cranky to the point of ultimately just always blowing his top. So you kind of knew when you were scheduling time calls and stuff, but invariably he'd be working on stuff through, and then the father would end up blowing up at the son because the son was trying to guide the father in a respectful way, always. Although they could also really get into it, just the nature of their family dynamic. Yeah. So navigating that was at times pretty challenging. And there were some other sibling issues in there where, again, passive siblings who for the most part stayed out of the deal, but there'd be issues, considerations that would come up.
Is there any way to prevent that messiness?
Boy, I mean, there's so many moving parts there, and there's so much history in there. You're talking about stuff that goes back potentially decades before the deal.
So just don't have a family business. If you do, just be prepared for it, basically. Potentially.
Yeah, I mean, you can understand why parents are proud to pass on shares to with the hopes the kids are going to carry it on. There's many family named businesses in this town where I'm sure the founders are proud to see that carried on. It's just, and you never know. I mean, when when another family business, they pass shares on to the sons, and the sons didn't do so well at first. They kind of screwed some stuff up. They ended up turning it around, but the parents aren't foreseeing that that's going to happen.
Right.
So,
talk to us about business models. You've seen a lot of industries. You've seen a lot of business models. As their attorney, you really know the ins and outs of these businesses. If you were 20, 25, and you were thinking about starting a business in 2024, or your son was thinking about starting a business 2025, given all the experience that you've seen and all the different industries you've seen, not only the valuations that you get in some industries, tech, for example, versus other industries, where do you think, two-part question, industry focus, where do you think the opportunity lies? And then number two, business model focus. Where have you seen business models that have been the most successful? Start with the industry side of things.
Again, these are really non-legal questions. So
they're not legal questions. Yeah. And so I have a disclaimer. Yeah. Any legal advice, I'm not asking you this from a legal perspective, but I think the wealth of experience that you have is so incredibly valuable information for entrepreneurs, business owners across the entire spectrum. Sure. Which is exactly why I'm asking.
No, and I get it. I wasn't so much concerned about the disclaimer. It's just more like, well, you're asking me to tell people what business to go into. I mean, I don't know.
Don't discredit yourself because I think you have a better idea than most of us entrepreneurs. Yeah. But given your experience, sure. If you're thinking about it and you've gotten to see what works and what doesn't, and that doesn't say it will work again, you kind of you get a feel for the trends, and because you're so involved in some of these deals.
Yeah. Well, I guess two things come to mind. The first one is, speaking very generally, find something that you want to do, that you love doing. That goes frankly to the practice of law. I mean, I've told many junior associates or people considering going into law, a lot of people leave this business. It doesn't matter how well you're compensated or how prominent you think you are. If you don't like what you're doing, you're going to hate it. It's long hours. It's just like being an entrepreneur. It's long hours. It's stressful. There are times you're fed up, you're neglecting your family and all that stuff. So first things first is if you're thinking of doing any kind of a business, it's got to be something that you want to do and that interests you. And obviously that somehow falls within your skill set. Um, in terms of actual businesses in this day and age, I guess, number one, there are certain types of things that people are always going to need, right? In Arizona, they're always going to need air conditioning. There's always going to need garbage pickup. There's just things that um, there's plenty of stuff out there that is still, call it old world type industry, that even with AI and everything else, you're always going to need those things. And Warren Buffett referred to it as the toll bridge, right? Um, those are great businesses, and I worked with a lot of very successful people that were blue collar people that did a blue collar trade, maybe never with the expectation they were going to turn this thing into a 10, 20, 30, 40, $50 million company, but that's what they did. And so if that's where people's interests lie, I don't think that's going to change. I mean, there'll be new ways of doing things, but I think the other thing is for people that are doing other types of businesses, I think scalability is a big thing, especially with anything that's sort of technology related. I think any business that is involves making things, manufacturing. The more that the cost of manufacturing more goes up with the volume of what you're manufacturing, that's a different degree of scalability than design some software and then it doesn't cost anything to reproduce it or have it downloaded. You can grow that business much larger. So those are the two kind of main things that come to mind.
Have you ever helped an e-commerce company sell?
Trying to think. No, I think I've kind of shied away from that stuff just because of the regulatory sort of angles with that. I've worked with a couple of clients in that space, and I've sort of known where my Peter principle line is, where I'm like, look, I can advise you up to here on these things, but once you start getting into e-commerce regulation and stuff, I'm not your guy. I could learn it, but you don't want to be paying me to learn on the job. There are people out there that really know that stuff.
If someone came again, and this is all in the context of the experience that you have, and having a Windows view into so many different businesses and the ins and outs, not only from deal structure, but operationally. Like, you get to learn these businesses operationally in and out, whether, especially if you're on the buy side, well, I imagine on the sell side, but if you're going through due diligence, like, how can you be zealous for your client if you don't understand what they're either buying or what they're selling? So if someone came to you and said, Garth, you're an awesome attorney, you've got a lot of experience, here's $1 million, go start a business, what would you do?
Boy. Well, the first thing I'd probably do is take a month off and go think, because I can't say there's anything right off the top. I've always wanted to do this, or I've always wanted to do that. I'd have to put some thought into that. I think with where my skill set is, which is more what's in my head versus my hands, it would probably be me leaning more to, like I said, some sort of a business that's scalable. But there's so many great ideas out there, and I have been incredibly privileged to work with so many cool companies, whether it's in an M&A deal or just being their outside counsel. It's one of the best things about this job. It keeps it fresh.
You're never bored, I imagine.
And you're always learning.
Yeah.
I'm always learning.
Yeah.
And I love visiting, just like when I came in here today and kind of walking through your back and, as I said, kind of seeing where the sausage is made. I love that. Yeah. I love walking the shop floor of a company, or it's really cool.
Do you, and I don't even know if the advice you just gave is you take a month off to think. I wish when I sold my company, I had talked to you and heard that advice, because after selling it, I was real lost. And then I just wanted to do something, because entrepreneurs, we tend to we can't be idle for a while. And you don't take time to think, whether you've just sold your company or you're thinking about starting a company, really put some thought into it. Don't just do it because you're an entrepreneur and you want to do something and try something. And so That's incredible advice, Garth. Just think, because I think for me, and I speak for a lot of entrepreneurs, sometimes we don't. We just act, and we got that kind of hyper aggressive. We want to do something, and we don't actually take the time to stop and think meticulously about what industries do I want to be in. And now, for me, at the point where I am having had successes and failures, I'm starting to learn. I tell her manufacturing, e-commerce, manufacturing, e-commerce. Why? Scalability. And when I think about having been in the garbage industry, that is a blue collar, which I'm so thankful for, boots up, every single day, trucks breaking down. And the scalability factor is certainly there, but over a very long period of time. And that's not a bad thing, but it's also a very capital intensive industry.
And labor intensive, is another thing. The other thing I'll say though is sometimes, especially if you're young, sometimes you can just roll the dice and go for it.
Yeah.
My daughter, I'm gonna do a little proud papa moment. My
Fantastic.
daughter, she started a company in high school. She was always a really avid gymnast as a kid. Never that great, which she would admit. I'm not talking smack about my daughter, but she reached a point where she got too tall, and I think a fear factor for the skills she was rising into took over. But she just stayed with it, stayed passionate. She found other ways to stay occupied. She started blogging for a website. This was, in high school, or even maybe in middle school when she started doing that. And then got involved with some other stuff, and then decided she was going to start up a website that was sort of started off as sort of like a Facebook for gymnasts, where they could upload their stats and videos and photos, and it was a revenue model. It was a subscription model that moved into branded apparel, a lot of leotards and sweats and stuff like that. Did this all through high school, all through college. Grew this thing. My wife and I are just kind of watching this, and she's lucky to have a dad that could help her form an LLC. It's the basic stuff, but for the most part, we had nothing to do with this. And we just kind of would sit back. We're not entrepreneurs, and watch her do this. And it was just her passion. And she had the odd stumble here or there, nothing ever that terrible. Just learned on the way. She sold half the company to her main supplier when she graduated college about a year and a half ago. So she now continues. She's still the president of that company, and she does some other stuff for the supplier company. And she's 24 years old, and she's just done this all on her own. She got a business degree from ASU, so she could have done a more traditional path, but she just wanted to do this. And I kind of sit back and go, there's a lesson there. If she had come to me for advice saying, I think this is what I want to do, I would have said, really? I don't, you're awfully young. You need to get a few years experience first, do this, do that. And instead she just said, I'm going to go for this. Now, look, she's very fortunate. She grew up in a stable house. She never had to pay any bills. I'm not saying every young entrepreneur can do that, especially when they're starting out later and they've moved out of their parents' house. But there is something to be said for just going for it.
Your point is very, very well received, because I think that for the youth, you have nothing to lose. You really, if you're 20, 21, 22, and she started in middle school, which, first off, that's an awesome story. And I hope she's still president of the company, still owns 50%. And she's kind of continuing to focus with it. I love that she partnered with her main supplier. That's actually can be really smart.
And they've been really good to her.
Yeah. And apparel supplier or what?
Yeah.
Okay.
So her company's called Chalk Warrior.
Okay.
And then that company was Ozone Leotard. So they were her main leotard supplier, but then they've done other stuff together, and they've been really good to her, and she's got some good mentorship. And
and she's just going to keep growing it.
Seems like.
That's fantastic. Yeah. And to your point, I think once you get a family, and again, I'm not saying this in a disparaging way, it's a lot harder when you have a family and responsibilities and all these other. But when you're young, just try stuff. If you enjoy something, try something. And what concerns me, and I'm curious to hear your take, not only as a father, but someone living in our 21st century, where everything comes so easily. We can get information in 2 seconds. Who knows whether it's factual? And I'm sure you deal with that all the time. Well, I looked it up on AI, or I did this. And then you're like, okay, well, that's nice. It's not right. But this thought process of sticking to it and just having the grit, I'm concerned that, it seems to be permeating every generation, but I'll stick to the younger generations. there is this level of inability to have a commitment to consistency. And being an entrepreneur is hard. And you've seen a lot of successful entrepreneurs, primarily successful entrepreneurs. Have you ever seen any that just in 2 years turned it into $10 million company? Or, what's the shortest time period that you've seen for the sale of a company in your experience?
Probably the best success story that I can think of, the one that I mentioned earlier about the friend that started up this company and made the wise decision not to grant that 5% warranty. I mean, I think that was about a 9 or 10 year path from start to finish, start to sale.
Which is in the lifetime of companies a very short lifespan.
And that was a significant sale. Now, right place, great idea. Internet security. So to some extent, right place at right time. Also, when it first started, it was when the financial crisis hit. So in some ways, right idea, wrong time. Could have waited a year or two, which was a challenge for them. But smart guy, incredibly hardworking, partnered with another very smart guy, a guy he had known from business school, had a very solid board of directors that he populated early. But they learned along the way and they adapted. The business that they sold was not the business they started. They grew into various aspects. And I mean, there was just a lot of things when you look at what makes a successful entrepreneur and you go, okay, there you go. Good person, good team, open to advice, open to being adaptable.
Were you involved at the beginning?
I was with the company from beginning to end. Yeah.
That's fantastic.
Yeah. And it was fun. I mean, and I'm incredibly happy for him.
Yeah.
And he deserved it because there were some lean years. So yeah, that was a really fun one to watch.
When you think about, I asked you if someone gave you $1 million.
Yeah.
When you think about all the entrepreneurs that you've worked with, do you do 50-50 buy side, sell side, or what is your mix there?
Nowadays it's probably around that. Used to be, I was more on the sell side.
Okay.
Since then I've got, 3 or 4, what I'd call serial acquirer companies.
Okay.
So because of that, they call me up every other month or two with another deal. Yeah.
So you spend 50% of your time helping companies buy other companies and 50% of your time helping companies sell their company.
Yeah.
When you think about all the people that you've worked with and knowing their background, what advice could you give about starting something from scratch and building something versus buying a company that maybe already has the nuts and bolts there?
It's a really good question. It's funny. I follow various people on Twitter, and there's a person. Her name is Cody Sanchez, I think it is, and she's a serial entrepreneur, but she buys these small businesses, and she often talks about. This is one of her points she talked about recently. I saw it, and she sort of advocated for why start something from scratch if you can buy it, when the bugs will have been worked out, the location, if it's a physical location, will have been established, a customer base will have been established. You've got something to work from, and you can build on that. Some really, really good points there. Now, the answer may be because what I want to do, there is either that business doesn't exist yet, or it doesn't exist and it's not, or it exists, but it's not for sale, or it's not of the type of business I want to run. There could be various reasons. But it's absolutely, if you just say, I want to go into business X, a really good question would be, do I want to start this from scratch, or is there one out there that I could acquire and then change it as I see fit once I've acquired?
And when you think about the businesses that you've helped sell, and again, I'm putting you on the spot here, so I'm mindful of that. Are the majority of them started from scratch, or did they acquire and then turn it into something that was much larger and maybe meld it how it needed to be?
Are you talking about businesses that I've represented on the sell side?
Yes.
Well, it depends. A lot of the family-owned businesses were started from scratch, but they might have been started a generation or two earlier, or certainly many years before I was involved. In other cases, I'm representing a company that's selling off a subsidiary or a division, which they may have developed on their own, or they may have previously acquired. But for the family businesses, they tend to have been organic at some point. Yeah.
And when you talk about these serial acquirers, When you look at where you're finding the majority of buying opportunities, what industries are these serial acquirers? People hear the word serial and they automatically run to tech.
Right.
Is that the case?
No, no. So nowadays, when we're talking about serial acquirers, we're talking about private equity or family offices.
Hmm.
Um, so it used to be when a company bought your company, that company was some big company that wanted to add you and fold you into their business. A strategic buyer, we would
Hmm.
call them. Most buyers nowadays are what we call private equity, or to some extent family office. So private equity is simply it's an investment vehicle. It's a fund of some type that they've raised private capital from other investors. That's why it's called private equity. They take that equity and then they mix it with bank borrowing to raise, and then they go in and they buy an operating company. Usually, when they do that, they want, because these are financial engineers, they're not operators per se, so they don't want to just take over the company and kick out the management. They will want executive management, especially the owner, to stick around for 5 years, let's say, have them retain a piece of equity either directly in the company, or they'll get equity in the acquisition company that's going to buy their company, but they kind of stay on board
Hmm.
to operate. A family office is very simple. The only real difference is, speaking in generalities, is that a family office entity, they just use their own money equity. They don't bring in outside investors. All right. So the whole business model, and I'll just use the term private equity going forward. The whole business model for private equity is they buy a company, they see value in it, but what they're doing is they're buying it to sell it. They're buying it with a view that we see that there's things we can do to this company to help it grow. Typically, triple its value is sort of the basic goal. Hit a triple and sell it in 4 to 6 years, just say 5 years on average, at that triple valuation. So just like people that invest in real estate, you buy real estate to sell it X number of years down the road. Same idea.
Hmm.
In its simplest sense, it's done as one company. You buy it and then you sell it. Um, the other approach is they will buy a company, which they'll call that a platform acquisition, and then they'll buy other similar companies or related companies in the space to add to that company. Those are referred to as bolt-on acquisitions. Uh, the idea being that together the sum of those parts are greater than in value than the whole. But again, they'll grow them and then ultimately sell them. That's the vast majority of buyers. So because that is the private equity model, which is to buy,
Hmm.
if you have a client like that that's doing that, they're calling you up somewhat regularly saying, okay, what do you want to buy? Or we have another deal for you. Now, to your question about industry, you're right. A lot of it was in tech early, but there's so much money in these private equity firms. I mean, there's so much baby boomer generation money that's invested. They're out to buy just about anything and everything in any industry you can think of. So they're all over the place. In fact, most of the deals I've done on the sell side in the last 5 to 7 years have not been tech. They've been in the trades or other industrial manufacturing.
By trades, you mean electricians, plumbers, construction, waste management services, industrial
Pool
services.
builders. Yep. Yep.
When you think about private equity and you talk about they want to buy, and as you said, they're primarily financial buyers,
Yep.
you work with strategic buyers as well.
Yep.
But in the private equity world, primarily financial buyers. What methods are they primarily using? You talked about the bolt on acquisition, kind of piecing together a package and then reselling it to someone else for X value. Outside of that, what methods are they using in that 4 to 6 time period that you've seen to triple a company's value? Because that's not easy to
Nope.
do.
Well, for starters, by the way, I'm going to add in one more variable that you do have strategic buyers that are kind of owned by private equity. So there can be a bit of a hybrid there, but ultimately, even then, when that happens, the private equity is ultimately looking to sell that strategic.
Mhm.
Okay. Um, it's, again, good question. And this can be a frustration for sellers because a lot of times what you'll hear about when private equity comes in, even if they want the original owner to stay on as chair or CEO, they want to bring in what they refer to as professional management, meaning, company X that's being acquired, the wife has been the CFO/controller, and she might have done a very good job, but they want to bring in a professional CFO that really understands financial engineering and more in-depth tax view and things like that. Or they'll bring in a more sophisticated president or COO, what have you. But they're going to do a bunch of stuff to grow revenues, because ultimately there's only so much you can do tweaking costs to raise your profitability. At the end of the day, top line is what matters. So they're going to have some sort of a plan for how we're going to grow revenues. And that could be anything from as simple as we're going to raise prices to, well, we're going to expand this business into these other areas, or because this will be bolted onto this other business, there's going to be some synergies there. They can feed off each other. It could be any number of things. And that gets into areas that's outside my expertise. But the one thing I will say is, and I've heard this so many times from smaller business owners that have sold to private equity firms, especially where they're staying on after, is frustration. Oh, they're screwing everything up. I'm so pissed off. I'm so disappointed that I sold. And the rationale there is they told me they love my company. They told me I had the secret sauce. They told me, you've been so successful, we want that company. And now they're changing everything. My employees are annoyed. My customers are annoyed. And it's so frustrating. Going back to, this was my baby. This is, and I get it, but it's for starters, it's the buyer's right to do that. They have a plan. These are very smart people, and they've done this many times. So from the ground, at times it'll look like they are screwing things up, and to some degree they are. It's sort of destructive change, but they have some sense of what they're doing. And I can't tell you statistically how many times, more times than not, it works, but I've heard that grumble so many times. It's something I would tell people, be aware of. And there's probably not a lot you can do about it. At that point, you are on board mostly as a passive owner, indirectly as through this sort of structure that's been created. And it's a bit of kind of, buckle up. It's good if you can educate yourself in advance, ask questions. What are you going to do? How are you going to change my business? How are you going to get to 3 times earnings in 5 years? But yeah.
Yeah. And for me, it I don't want to say it surprises me that when you sell to private equity, what you kind of know what you're getting. If you have a family-owned business or something of that nature. I say that's not necessarily true, because there are private equity companies that want to keep it exactly the same,
Yep.
but just market it more or bring you into more stores. And so it's not completely changing the operations and the management structure and all those types of things. But more often than not, in a financial purchase, it's fair to say that they're going to really upend a lot of things and do things differently.
Yep.
And, for me, when we sold our garbage company, I didn't sell to private equity, but another competitor. So it was very different. But it's also hard as an entrepreneur when you sell it, to see all these changes. And, from a bird's eye view, they probably should have been made about 5 to 10 years ago, and they're good changes, but it's different, and you were doing it the wrong way, and it's hard to hear that.
Well, that's an excellent point. And by the way, I don't mean to beat up on private equity. I mean,
No,
you'll get that with strategic buyers too.
Yeah.
But to your point exactly, you'll have businesses where, my customer's all mad because now every time they put in an order, they have to fill out a purchase order. It used to just be, you could pick up the phone and call me. And it's like, well, yeah, but you know what? That's not really, or I used to be able to slap down $10,000 at a restaurant on the company credit card to buy a good customer a bottle of wine. And I tried that last week, and my company card was declined, and it was embarrassing. And it's like, yeah, but
probably not the best business practice.
Right. So yeah, there are absolutely a lot of legitimate things that a buyer, be they private equity, strategic, what have you, will impose afterwards that will maybe frustrate a seller. And there may be some stuff that arguably is kind of dumb.
Yeah.
But
yeah, I've seen we've all heard the story. I think private equity gets a certain bad rap because we always hear the bad ones. They came in and they fired half the people and they destroyed the whole company and all these. And certainly there's models where it's, well, we're going to buy it and we see that these assets are more valuable separated and kind of piecemeal. You'll find that out during the due diligence process, right?
Yeah.
But in general, like private equity, they generally want to do what's best for the business because they have a financial interest to do it.
Yep.
And sometimes the choices they have to make are challenging. And so I think to your point, if you're someone who's selling and you're thinking about selling to private equity, just have a good understanding of what am I getting myself into? What
Yep.
are their intentions with it?
The one thing I would say about private equity versus, say, a pure strategic buyer is, and this goes more into the negotiation at the beginning of the pricing, is, there's that old real estate investing adage that says, what matters is what you pay for the property, not for what you sell it for. And, again, private equity are buying to sell. So they want to get the lowest price possible. It's not unheard of, maybe even more than not unheard of, for a letter of intent to be signed at a price that has the owner either excited or at least willing to do the deal. And then after a certain amount of due diligence or quality of earnings, buyer comes back and says, it's only worth 80% of that or what have you. And that can feel at times like a bait and switch. I think with strategic buyers, I'm not saying that couldn't happen, because it definitely can and does happen. But I think strategic buyers that are buying with a longer term view, specifically not with a view to selling in 5 years, they're willing to probably stretch a little more. They've got a longer term perspective. I'm not saying that's going to happen every time, but I think I've seen it enough. There's a theme there that I recognize. And look, if there are legitimate reasons to lower a price after a letter of intent's been signed, it's going to happen. And I've been on the buy side, and it's totally legit at times. But other times, it does feel a little bit like maybe being played a bit. My advice in that case would be, to the extent that the seller's comfortable doing it, is get as much information to the buyer in advance before you settle on a price. Let them drill down on the financials, the QOV and all. Then come back and say, okay, now we'll talk price. But when we talk price now, unless you find something really bad going forward, there's not going to be any discussion about a reduced price. I'd say most times you can't follow that path. I think there's a lot of competition, even now with the economy having cooled down some in the last year or two. There's still a lot of competition among private equity firms to find companies to buy, and so they're really eager to get sellers under a letter of intent, even if it's not binding. There's a sense of, okay, we're kind of half pregnant, and so they're eager to get a number down that'll make the seller happy, knowing that we the buyer aren't necessarily wedded by that. So it's something to be aware of.
Yeah, and I think it's an excellent point, because there are, let's just call it what it is. There are buyers out there who want to get someone's heart involved, and this is their strategy. And I'm not saying, I'm not disparaging this. They know in due diligence they're going to find. So you get to the table, you get expectations set, and then in due diligence, that's where they're like, now we get the price. Now we nitpick at everything, or legitimately, especially with a lot of family-run companies where, like you said, they put down a credit card, or you've got a vendor that's 80%. There are reasons that it's not as valuable. And what I'm hearing you say is that's typically more common with a financial buyer than it is with a strategic buyer, because a strategic buyer, what that means, I'm not sure if we've quantified this, they're in the industry typically, or you're a synergistic purchase, meaning maybe you were, in your daughter's case, the supplier, and you have an idea of what you're getting into, as opposed to, I'm someone with a lot of money and I'm just trying to find a company that I can buy and sell in 5 years. I have no clue about the industry or anything, but I have general business knowledge of how these things work and how I can increase revenues, raising prices, cutting costs, marketing extra, whatever. Is that a fair assessment?
It is. And again, I really want to emphasize, I don't want to put a black stroke on private equity. I represent a handful of, either call them private equity or otherwise large serial acquirer, and they're extremely decent, ethical people. So, I mean, I think most of them are. But the thing to remember is they have their own fiduciary and other obligations to their own investors. So, they're not sort of just greedy Wall Street people. So they're looking out for the best interest from their side. But what this brings us back to is, the question of what can people be doing, potentially many years down the road. Have good financial statements, have good financial records. The more that a prospective buyer can drill down and understand your financials, the financial performance of the company, the sooner they can do that, the more likely you're going to start off with a price that's going to remain the same.
Mm-hmm.
Whereas if you've got messy financials or no financials, or you've taken a lot of liberties in your financials that come out in a quality of earnings, that's where you more likely you're going to run into these issues.
Yeah, and I think you bring a good point. Certainly, hopefully it doesn't come across that we're trying to disparage private equity, because that's not the case. As a matter of fact, private equity, I think it can be and a lot of times an amazing thing. It helps a family company bring whatever good or service they're providing to a broader audience and helps grow that, whether it's a family dream or family legacy, or they're providing a unique value or good and service or a really great experience, and they're offering it to more customers. And so I think I think private equities actually can be a fantastic thing.
Well, they are the exit strategy now for most companies. I mean, back up until Sarbanes-Oxley came in, the IPO, everybody used to say, I'm going to grow my company, I'm going to do an IPO. At least that's especially on the kind of the more tech side. That was the exit strategy everybody looked at. Almost nobody talks about an IPO anymore. Everybody talks about, I'm going to grow the company, I'm going to sell it, and it'll probably be to private equity. So they have become the market for exit businesses.
Yeah, and so IPO has just become too stinking expensive. I remember when I was auditing at Ernst & Young, and I read somewhere, if you're going to just take a normal company and take it IPO, the additional costs you incur for reporting and all the other things, just not changing anything. I don't remember if it was like $1 million a year or $1 million a quarter. Maybe
it was $1 million a year within, I'd say, 5 years after Sarbanes-Oxley came in.
Okay.
So now I could only, guess.
Yeah. So it makes sense why we've kind of shifted to private equity with that. But to our point earlier, it's fair to say, and it's logical from a business perspective, typically a strategic buyer is going to be willing to pay a little bit more for you. And again, we're generalizing, than a financial buyer. Fair assessment?
Yeah. In my experience, yeah.
In your experience. And that seems to be the common, what I've read in private equity and things that I've seen in my very short time period. You've been very gracious with your time, Garth, so I don't want to take too much of it, but there's certain things that I think you have unique insight into. And I want to get back to this question about business models. We've talked about industry. We've touched the lines around valuation and multiples, and I think you do a great job in this article of talking about that. So I don't want to delve too deeply into the specifics or the technical side of that. But there's multiple business models out there. There's what I call the Walmart business model of low margin, very, very high volume. And then there's the Whole Foods model, higher margin, lower volume. I'm simplifying it. I recognize that, but, and just focusing on one industry. Is there any transaction or business that you walked away from and you saw the business model that was not the good or service that they were doing. I'm talking about the business model, the operational side of things, or how they conducted business. Because there's obviously a lot of unique goods and services. And to your point earlier, maybe you want to get into business and it hasn't been invented or started yet. So aside from the uniqueness of a new good or service or product, is there any business model that you've seen be particularly more successful or unique amongst all of your sellers or buyers that stands out to you?
That's a really broad question, but maybe I can give you one example where I thought, wow, this is really clever. And this goes back to the example of this internet security services company, which was sort of personal security.
Okay.
The leading competitor marketed their services directly to consumers. So, again, I'm not going to name, you'd see their ads on TV, and so you could go subscribe and pay whatever it was, $12 a month or whatever. But every sale they made was to an individual. Okay. So you think about the costs, client acquisition cost, I think they call it. This company, this client of mine, they started off with something similar, and they still offered that. It was a way you could buy their product, but they came up with the idea of, this is going to be a growing industry. People need this. Companies should be offering this as a benefit to their employees. So rather than selling this to individual people, we're going to go to companies and say, hey, we will package this up. these will be the services. You can offer this to all of your employees. They market it as, hey, look, when you have an employee that has an identity theft incident, they're distracted at work, they have to take time off to maybe go to the DMV or go to the courts, whatever, to clear their name and all this kind of stuff. You're losing productivity. You've got stressed out employees. So they had this really smart
That's
marketing.
brilliant.
Yeah. And they went to the company and said, look, we'll package this up. We'll sell it to you for X amount. You can offer it to all your employees. And there'll be this optional thing that if the employees want additional services, they can pay extra on their own and subscribe. I mean, I was just like, that was so, and that, again, the timing at the time when there was so much identity theft fraud growing, it was brilliant. And it's clearly one of the reasons they became such a successful company. But meanwhile, there was this other company that was still plodding along, and they did fine as far as I know, but I mean, again, you go to client acquisition costs, just the overhead, the ability, the scalability. And yeah, that's one that's always kind of stuck with me, is that was really smart.
Have you seen, going back to Buzz and Paramount, patents? They created incredible things, and they patented to them. You hear all this thought, or you hear a lot of chatter about, are patents worth it? Are patents not worth it? When you look at all the spectrum of companies you've sold, how frequently, and perhaps it's industry specific, but maybe not, certainly look at the blue collar Paramount Pool and Spa, how frequently are patents involved or a key valuation aspect for companies? And I always say, I like to believe that there's nothing new. I like to believe there's always something new to be invented, and then every time I try, everybody's invented it already, which obviously isn't true. But how frequently are those happening in the 21st century?
Well, I mean, I think they're happening a lot. There was this old, you've probably seen the meme that's gone around. There was some commissioner of the patent office in something like 1897 that said, at this point, we should shut down the patent office because there's nothing left to be invented that hasn't already been invented, or something like. Every time we think there's nothing left to invent, right?
And that's the basis of my question.
Yeah. So I mean, I think for companies, they're constantly coming up with new things that are patentable. I think the more interesting thing, though, I think maybe I can say for entrepreneurs who would listen to this, is that I do get from time to time people that will come to me either in my professional capacity or just in a conversation saying, I've got this great idea. I want to patent this. As if getting the patent, all of a sudden people are going to be pounding on your door for your product. And so my question is, okay, that sounds interesting. And so then what are you going to do if you get the patent? What do you mean? Well, who's going to do your manufacturing? How are you going to sell this? What's your, just all these things that, and there's just this blank look on the face because as far as they go is just, and that's not in every case. I mean, I have some entrepreneurial clients I'm not a patent lawyer, but we have very good patent lawyers in our firms that will come to me and I'll set them up with one of our guys. And they have some sense of how they're going to do this, or maybe even they've already got somebody lined up, but they don't want to go to that person until they've at least got the application filed. But a patent in and of itself is merely creating a legally protectable right in an invention, right? So, okay, great, you got a patent, but you still have to make the thing, and you got to market it and sell it and do everything that goes with selling a product. And if it's any kind of a regulated product, you also got to figure that the regulation side. Does it have electrical components that have to pass testing? Is it a medical device? Or there's all that stuff. So, while the process of getting a patent may only be in the simplest sense, I don't even know what it is nowadays to call it $5,000, $7,500. I mean, you might be 100,000 in before you're ready to go to market. So
that's a great point. Yeah, because you do hear that. Oh, I want to patent it. Okay, well, that's a really good point.
I've had this with my wife a few times. She'll say, "I have this idea, and I want to get a patent." I said, "Yeah, and then what?" And then she looks at me. I get the stink eye, and because I'm the party pooper, right? But and then the other thing, of course, is enforcement. So if someone infringes your patent, okay, well, the normal first step is you write a letter to them saying, or your lawyer does, saying you're infringing my client's patent. And in the best case, the other side goes, "Oops, our mistake. We'll change things. We'll fix that." But more likely than not, they're either going to ignore you or they're going to fight you. And now you've got, potentially years of litigation and all the costs that go with it. So a patent has value, but it doesn't have as much value if you are an entrepreneur with not a lot of financial backing as you might think it does.
Yeah. D- Do you follow your sellers once they sell? A lot of them are.
It depends. I
Okay.
mean, I have people that are referred to me as sort of a one and done type thing.
Hmm.
For some period of time after closing, there's usually some follow up communications on stuff. I've had other sellers that I stayed in touch with either because they either were friends or became friends, or just kind of acquaintances, or they've the company that I've got one guy who sold his business a few years back. He ended up becoming sort of the head of M&A for the company, the organization that bought his company, and now he sends me all of their other acquisitions to do. So
Fantastic.
it's all over the place.
And buyers, do you follow? Do you kind of see what they do with the business and where they take it, or not as frequently?
Not as frequently. Usually, if I do hear about that, like I said, I'm talking with a seller I've stayed in touch with, and
Hmm.
it's usually some kind of grumble going on.
So the sellers that you've seen after they've sold, typically these deals can be very lucrative. Are they happier? Are they lost? And the premise of my question is people always believe that that's the pinnacle of getting this big fat check, and then I'm going to be really happy, which is false. End of story. False. Not that money can't,
Yeah,
that you can't do some enjoyable things,
yeah.
but um, what is your experience on how sellers are 6 to 12 to 18 to 24 months after they've gone through a meaningful life change like that?
It, it's all over the map, but I would say by and large, it's positive.
Okay.
Um, I have seen. I think I mentioned in my article one story where I was representing the buyer, and we acquired a guy's company, and it was old school. It was a table closing. It was the early 2000s, meaning we were all around the table, and a check was handed over. And yeah, the guy looked like someone had just shot his favorite dog. Um, he was the only guy in the room not smiling, and he kind of shuffled out. And he was a younger guy. That wasn't going to be his retirement, but he looked like a guy that had regrets selling his company. But I think most people, and I mean the vast majority, it's a positive outcome for them.
Hmm.
Um, whether that's so they can retire, or they can go. Some of these guys, they can't help themselves. Even if they think they're done with business, they're serial entrepreneurs. They got to go
Hmm.
do the next thing.
Hmm.
And so, um, the like I say, I mean, the cases I hear where there's some sort of a negative aspect, it's usually people that have retained some sort of an equity piece or a management piece in the company they sold, and they're not happy seeing the changes.
Yeah. Just a few more questions for you, Garth. When someone's setting up a company, sometimes you have a disparity in the financial capabilities of the parties that want to go into business. Maybe one's the expert, the engineer, let's use this as an example, and the other one's got the capital, and they're trying to figure out um, how to set up the company or how ownership can be determined based on that. And, quantifying the intangible value of someone's experience or expertise when you have cold hard cash can be very challenging. But as you've pointed out in many situations, the very beginning of a company and how you do it needs to be done right. Otherwise, it can come back to bite you. In a scenario like that,
Yeah.
give us advice on how to approach a situation like that.
Um, Again, it's all over the map depending on the circumstances. The example you give, one guy's got the money, one guy's got the expertise. It might be as simple as 50-50. Usually it's not. Usually the money person is getting more of the ownership. They're the ones that are putting real capital at
Hmm.
risk. Especially if that person who's got the expertise is also drawing some kind of a salary because they got to live on.
Hmm.
But that's fully negotiable, right? So it might be 60-40, 75-25. Um, and that's a risky venture for the person putting in the money, because if that person with the expertise one day says, I don't like my partner, I don't like this business, or they get hit by a bus on the way into work, what have you, you got nothing.
Skin in the game is so important.
Well, but but that if that individual is the business, if the business doesn't go on without that person, there's no depth on the
Yeah.
bench, right? That's very risky. The one thing I will say, and I counsel clients against this from time to time, is they'll bring on a new person, not the only person, but we're bringing on a new president or we're bringing on a new, and they want to give them equity right out of the gate. And I'm always like, number one, again, that person is no longer just an employee; they're an owner with you. even if they're a minority owner. And number two, it just creates things you got to be thinking about. What happens if that person quits? What if we fire that person? You have to have mechanisms in place to get that equity back. The last thing you want to be doing is granting equity to a handful of employees, and then all of a sudden they're no longer involved with the company, but they're still entitled to some piece of the company's profits. So, and I also think that any kind of equity grant like that should be subject to some kind of a vesting period, whether that's time-based or performance-based. They should have to earn it. Unless it's a really key person, I generally, and I'm not so much talking about the example you gave now, but I'm not a fan of issuing any equity to somebody, at least for the first year. I mean, there ought to be a year where they're on board and you're just kind of feeling each other out.
Yeah.
And then after that, some sort of time-based or performance-based, grant over time.
Yeah, that's excellent advice, because you don't know who this person could be once they get involved. And it's kind of the same thing with partners until you've seen each of us in the hardest moments. You don't find the true measure of a man or woman during the easy, successful times. It's during the hardest times.
I mean, the upside of it is they will likely be more invested if they feel like an owner. And that's really the rationale behind doing it. But to me, it should be, I want to make you an owner too, but let's have a bit of time to see if this is.
And that's how you've seen it successfully used. Hey, you're key. We think you can be great, and we want to potentially, there may be ownership on the table. It's just, there's a process.
Yeah. I mean, I've seen it successfully also where they get some kind of equity right out of the gate. It's just something that the main owner should be thinking about. They shouldn't just randomly go, okay, I'm going to give this person some equity.
And I've got a million structure questions I can ask you, but I'm going to save those for Josh, because I think he can talk on those as well. Give us expectations. You talked about the importance of having a good team, tax attorney, a lawyer who's experienced, and you get what you pay for. From an expectation perspective, if there's someone that's thinking about selling their company, or they're thinking about buying a company and they want to come to you, is it a percentage of the deal? Are they fixed fees? Give us, again, I'm not asking specifics because it's a very broad question and every deal is different, but give us some expectation of what can a seller expect to pay in attorney's fees, and what can a buyer expect to pay if they're coming to you and saying, we want to buy a company in this industry. These are the qualifications.
I'll start off by saying it partly depends on the deal size. So let's just assume it's sort of an average middle market, say it's a low middle market, let's say $40 million. Once you get to a certain level, like north of 125 million, you get into some regulatory stuff, Hart-Scott-Rodino, things like that. So we'll leave that part out.
Okay.
Lawyers typically bill by the hour. And while we've tried for many years, including a real push a few years ago to come up with some other model that would work, we haven't been able to do it. And it's the deals themselves are so uncertain in terms of time. And sometimes, an example someone will say is, if I call a plumber and I say, I bought a toilet, I need to have it installed. And the plumber says, this is what it's going to cost. And that is what it's going to cost. And how come you lawyers can't do that with an M&A deal? And the answer is because all houses are basically built the same. The plumber's going to remove an old toilet. There's a water source coming out of the wall. He's going to hook that up. He's going to seal it. It's a finite, understandable process. M&A deals are all over the place. There's so many variables that we can't control. And by the way, this may sound like I'm making a bunch of excuses in advance.
No,
I will get to the answer to your question.
It's very logical.
But and by the way, this is one of the reasons I always advocate for get a really good lawyer. If it's not me, I don't care, but get a really good lawyer, because the deals that are done with a bad lawyer on the other side of the deal invariably take longer and therefore cost more. Even if you think that lawyer is, that lawyer's $300 an hour less than the other guy. It's like, yeah, but if it takes 5 times as long to get the deal done, you're not saving any money. And by the way, you're probably going to have stuff in the agreement that shouldn't have been in there if you had a good lawyer representing you. Deals that a typical private M&A deal, I'm going to say on average takes 3 to 4 months. They can happen faster and they can take longer. Most clients say to me, what's this going to cost? They'll say, what's your billing rate? And I always say, my billing rate's not as relevant because there's other people involved. It's more like, what's the aggregate cost? And I'll typically tell people, with no facts about the deal known, just the very basics, it's going to be an asset purchase deal or a stock purchase deal. It's going to be somewhere, $175,000, $200,000 in legal fees. And of course, that's a heck of a lot of money. And it doesn't sound as bad if it's a $100 million deal, doesn't, versus, $10 million deal as a percentage of the deal. But the same work has to get done. And it's all about how quickly it can be done, but done responsibly. You got to take a certain amount of time. The longer you spend negotiating, the more time you got to spend dealing with. Every deal has what I call a certain amount of hair on it, but the more hair on the deal, the more time you got to spend on it. If you have outside forces that interfere, I just had one this year. I had a deal representing a European company acquiring a small California company. They said, we think we can get it done in 6 weeks. I said, I don't think it's going to get done in 6 weeks, but I think you could get it done in 2 months. 6 months and many, many, many more legal fees than expected later because of some intervening things that came in.
Agencies in Europe or government agencies or
third parties in California that were interfering with the deal, or a family sale I did a few years ago. And again, this one is in California, but interference from the county board of supervisors that didn't want that family business being sold to a big, well-known conglomerate, and pulled out all the stops to stop the deal. So even if you don't have those big things that can interfere, it's just this process you have to go through. The more reasonable the parties are on both sides in negotiating, the more reasonable the documents that are served up, the quality of the lawyering on both sides. 75% of a general purchase agreement from deal to deal is mostly the same. Not word to word. You still have to read all the words.
Boilerplate, right?
It's not boilerplate, but structurally and thematically and content-wise, for the most part, what you're going to see as an experienced M&A lawyer. And then about 25% is the harder stuff. And that's assuming, the seller has good legal counsel. The buyer typically will serve up the purchase agreement. Not always, but typically. If the buyer knows what they're doing, and typically they will have good legal counsel, that you'll get that. If I'm representing the buyer and I do that, and a seller has good legal counsel, they're going to know what to focus on and what to go. Yeah, I know, I get it. That's a standard provision. Versus one that doesn't really know what they're doing and they question everything, right? I'm not going to agree to that. And no way my client's agreeing to that. And you've just tripled the length of time to get to the same place. So time is such a factor in these deals.
And is that that rough estimate that's the same on seller or buyer side?
Again, it depends, but typically, yeah.
Okay.
And I will tell you, I've done deals where I've come in well below that estimate, and I've done deals where I've come in well above.
Yeah.
It's so hard to, and that's why when someone says, "Can you do a fixed fee?" The answer is, it's too hard. For me to do it, I would have to charge a high enough fixed fee where there's a good chance you will end up getting burned in the end.
Yeah.
You the seller, or you the client, because you ended up paying more than you would have had to if we just done it by the hour. But it's a tricky. It's always kind of a tricky part of the process when you're introducing a client who has never bought or sold a company before, and what's this going to cost?
Yeah, and to your point, there's just so many variables. Anything you'd like to share with our audience, Garth, that we haven't already talked about, be it some specific technical expertise or advice, or just broad business advice, or anything at all?
I've had really, for the most part, very positive experiences with my clients. It's so important that the clients trust their professional advisors, be they the lawyers, the investment bankers, the accountants, what have you. And likewise, we have to be able to trust our clients. So information flow is so important. Again, if you're thinking about whether it's starting a business venture, or you've got some kind of a legal issue, or you're going to do an M&A deal, information flow and openness and honesty is so important, at least with a lawyer. I mean, that's all confidential. That's lawyer, attorney-client privilege. So I'm not saying I've had issues, at least not that often, where I feel like a client's withholding information. But generally speaking, you're paying a lot of money to a lawyer to get advice. And the best advice you're going to get is if they have the complete picture.
Yeah.
We're tools. Use us.
Yeah.
Right.
Oh, that's great advice.
Yeah.
And I have seen that there is this sense to, well, they don't need to know about that. Or if you're saying that, they need to know about it. It's just the end of the story. Garth, thank you so much for your time, your experience and expertise.
Yeah.
We really
appreciate
it.
Yep. You're welcome.
Thank you for listening to the Andrew Holland Podcast. Be sure to visit our website, theandrewhollandpodcast.com, for additional content on business, entrepreneurship, and everything in between. subscribe to our YouTube channel, The Andrew Holland Podcast, to get notifications when new podcasts have been released. And lastly, follow us on Twitter, A Holland Podcast. That's A Holland Podcast for all the conversations we're having outside the podcast. Thanks again so much for joining us this week. Have a great day, and we'll talk again next week.